Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for the 30-something episode of Agent Smith. Today is September the 16th, 2018. I welcome you. Feel free to take part in this conversation. This is for you and for me to learn. Agent Smith is here to share, but he also wants to learn from you. So if you have some perspective that you would like to weigh in on, please do so. Without further ado, we begin with the Agent Smith discussion. What's up, dude?
Hello.
Hey, dude.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty solid. Been having good streams lately.
Cool. Glad to hear it.
Yeah, my sleep schedule was flippity-flopped. Last Sunday, I was sleeping from around, 3 p.m. until past midnight or something. So that's what happened there. How have you been?
Oh, I'm doing all right. Doing some house sitting.
You're sitting on the house?
Sitting right on it.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's how you establish dominance over the home. To be on the eaves, like Santaman. That's cool. So if I had to pick one thing that stood out to me, they said, what's his butt? Manafort, I think, he's going to cooperate after he said that he wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
Is that surprising?
Unexpected. The Manafort's team had been, legal team had been cooperating with Trump's team. And apparently Trump's team had not been informed by Manafort's team that he was going to take that plea deal. So they were surprised, certainly. But it's not entirely surprising because there had been a lot of pressure on Manafort. So that was always a possibility. What's more surprising than the fact that he took a plea deal is the fact that Trump's team didn't know about it. That seems a little weird, so I'm not sure what's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, it hasn't really changed the fundamental calculus of what's been happening. You know, it's still very much an unfolding story, and it's still something that we're going to have to wait until the midterms to really see if anything comes of it.
Cool. It's the same long story that we've had for a while now. Just another puzzle piece. It's a 10,000 piece puzzle and we just got like 10 pieces. Nice.
Yeah, they're still building the case. The investigation will keep going. This isn't like a big breakthrough for them, I think. But yeah, it is another piece of the puzzle, as you say.
I did hear, I guess I read somewhere that the way that Russia may or may not have interfered with the US, they've done in the Ukraine and I think Georgia, they were saying, where it's not about like actively changing ballots and stuff, it's about putting words in people's mouths to get them to think about the situation in a certain way. Like I think they said in the Ukraine there was someone who started the same sort of chant of lock her up for a different person, but it's kind of figuring out what memes are catchy for a voter base and then using those patterns wherever it's useful to you to kind of expand your influence.
In other words, political campaigning.
Yeah, to be fair, yeah.
Yeah, they're not really doing anything that any other political group doesn't already do. And frankly, other native political groups in the US or probably also the Ukraine and Georgia use those methods a lot more effectively. Which is one of the reasons I'm a little skeptical that these are really particularly effective operations on the part of the Russian government, if it is indeed the Russian government doing it. Yeah, in the Ukraine and Georgia, you know, which is in what the Russian leadership calls Russia's near abroad. That's sort of what they think of as their sphere of influence. They've taken a very, not quite interventionist attitude, but they certainly have no qualms about, you know, dipping into the politics of those countries when they feel that their interests are at stake. In the Ukraine, obviously, that was NATO. Well, not NATO per se, but the Crimea specifically. and the unrest over after President Yushchenko's either ousting or retreat, depending on how you want to look at it. With Georgia, the famous example was the 2008 war over, what was it? South Ossetia, I think it was. Because North Ossetia is actually in Russia, so I think it was South Ossetia, which was a sort of statelet, if you will. It was technically a part of Georgia, but they had declared independence, you know, way back, not long after Georgia had broken away from the Soviet Union. And the Russians had peacekeepers there. You know, the Russians, after the Cold War ended, generally deployed peacekeepers to the various breakaway republics of the Soviet Union whenever a conflict broke out to try to act as, well, peacemakers. And they just kind of hung around for, what, 10, 15 years. The Georgian state was never able to really reconcile those separatists with any kind of new arrangement that would bring them back into the fold. So, South Ossetia, Ajuria, I think the other one was, and Abkhazia were all breakaway statelets in Georgia that the government was at odds with. And I think eventually, not long into, what was his name? The famous Georgian guy who became president and liberalized Georgia. I'm blanking out on his name. Well, the Georgian state basically invaded Ajuria and solved that forcefully. And it's not entirely clear what they were trying to do with South Ossetia, if they thought that they could do that with them as well, or if maybe they thought they would get US support, but they basically invaded South Ossetia as well. And a couple of Russian peacekeepers were killed in the operation. So, unsurprisingly, the Russian state did not take that very well and responded with a countervailing invasion of South Ossetia that pushed the Georgians out and then pushed on into Georgia itself. So, since then, and also due to Georgia's leaning towards the West under this president, whose name I'm still blanking out on, for those reasons, the Russian state has been a little bit antagonistic towards Georgia for the past 10-some years. It's gotten a little better since the new president came in Georgia. He's a billionaire, I think, who's known for being a little more pro-Russian. So that's alleviated tension a bit. I'm gonna look up that guy's name. Controversial. Saakashvili. That's what his name, Mikhail Saakashvili. He's a well-known figure in the region. He tends to make the news a lot. He wanted to westernize and liberalize Georgia and have it join NATO and, basically integrate with the West, which put him at odds with Russia, which was not terribly comfortable with that plan. He's also well known for some of his liberalization schemes. One of the things he did is fire all of the traffic police in Georgia, I think it was. And that was done to fight corruption, and his argument was that the traffic police were committing more crimes than they were resolving because they were so corrupt, so we just fired all of them, and it actually worked. There was actually a significant dip in crime and corruption as a result. Had to train a whole new cohort of traffic police, but apparently it was worth the effort. It's not uncommon in the region, in former Soviet areas, among others, for there to be endemic corruption amongst certain institutions. It's just sort of accepted that there are certain things you can do, like taking bribes as a policeman or a traffic policeman. That's not that unusual. It's so extensive that some American libertarians have actually commented in support of it because they see bribing a policeman to get out of a ticket as being more economically efficient than taking the ticket and having to go through the justice system.
Yeah, because that's a pain in the ass.
Yeah, exactly. So Saakashvili was famous for that, but he also got in a lot of trouble for corruption. His regime was, well, there was some corruption allegations, and then there was a big scandal over prisons. And I don't remember the exact context of it, but basically it was like prison for profit and abuse of prisoners and that kind of thing. So on that, he eventually was, lost an election basically, and the next guy promised to investigate him. and started going after him, which raised some questions about rule of law and transition of power in Georgia and whatnot. So there is some concern that some of the gains made under the Saakashvili administration might be lost, or at least might be being curbed by the new administration, but it hasn't become too bad, I don't think. At least I haven't read anything too egregious. Saakashvili himself was not terribly keen on being investigated, so he actually fled Georgia and went over to the Ukraine. And in the Ukraine, he basically started a new career as a politician under the Yushchenko government. It was basically the post-Yanukovych government in the Ukraine after the coup/uprising, again, depending on how you want to view that. And Saakashvili tried to be a reform candidate, basically pushing an anti-corruption agenda and pushing for reforms. And I think Odessa was where he was assigned. He was supposed to be the governor of Odessa, or the anti-corruption czar of Odessa, or some damn thing. And his anti-corruption platform, his attempt to implement anti-corruption policies was not successful because he faced a lot of pushback from local political elites in Odessa. It's all good and well if you want to implement anti-corruption measures, but you do need to have buy-in from not only the public, but also a critical mass of political elites. Otherwise, it's just not going to quite work. So he ended up losing that position, and eventually, I think he had a falling out with Yushchenko when he started criticizing some key people in Yushchenko's administration. And so he ended up basically getting chased out of the Ukraine. He had been given Ukrainian citizenship, but then I think it was stripped at one point. I think he did try to come back, though. I think there's famous footage of him coming back to the Ukraine, crossing the border, I think from Belarus maybe or something. I don't quite remember from where, but he crossed the border and there was a big crowd meeting him, and there was some debate about whether the crowd was legitimate supporters or whether they were just people he'd paid to meet him there. He's a colorful figure. Wherever he goes, he's always kind of in the limelight. And whether you see him as an avatar of anti-corruption and liberalism or just a self-interested blowhard, that kind of comes down to your individual politics. But he's definitely colorful, and he's one of the reasons that there has been tension between Russia and Georgia historically for the past 10, 15 years. That's kind of down to him as a leader.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that was a long tangent. Yes, Russia does interfere, or at least probably does interfere in the politics of its neighbors, like Ukraine and Georgia, in the same way that it does other ostensible targets. But I don't think it's terribly effective. You know, most of the reason that Russia has been successful in interfering in the politics of, say, the Ukraine is not so much because they're just masters of, you know, bending people to their will through angry Twitter posts, so much as because there are just inherent cleavages within the Ukraine. And one side of that, you know, one particular faction within the Ukraine is pro-Russian and anti-Western. And so Russia has just been good about tapping that pre-existing anger. You know, we've talked before about how the principal gist of Russian, or, you know, any country's attempt to interfere in another state comes down more to exploiting pre-existing tensions than it does when creating them. So in the Ukraine, there's definitely a lot of pre-existing tension between pro-Russian and pro-Western factions, and that's a simplification. It goes deeper than that. But roughly speaking, there's pro-Western and pro-Russian factions, and the Russian government just basically sides with the pro-Russian faction, with the pro-Russian political forces. Although even there's tension. You know, you could argue they're not very good at managing even that. There was a major leader of, I think, the Donetsk Republic, the People's Republic of Donetsk, I think it was, and he was assassinated recently in the past month, and it's not really clear who did it. The Russian media was quick to point the finger at the Ukrainians, and that's certainly quite possible. Obviously, the Ukrainian authorities have good reason to want separatist leaders dead. But it's not inevitably the case that it was the Ukrainian government. I mean, it could have been rivals within the Donetsk People's Republic. It could have been the Russian government itself. Over the course of the conflict in the eastern Ukraine, the Russian government has kind of been at pains to try to influence political leaders in the breakaway republics. I think it's Donetsk and Lugansk that were the two that tried to break away. And some of those leaders have not been terribly keen to be led. They're happy to receive support, but they don't really take marching orders, and that's kind of made for some tensions between Moscow and some of those leaders. There was a big cleaning out at one point a few years ago in which a lot of the leaders, especially some of the criminal elements, were basically pushed out. You know, they were either arrested or overthrown in a kind of soft pseudo-coup in Donetsk and Lugansk. And the result was more stable leadership, a more centralized leadership around certain separatist leaders that were a little more explicitly pro-Russian and not quite so independent. So it might be that this guy, and I don't remember his name, but it might be that this guy was getting a little too independent and was not really quite towing the line that Moscow wanted and went after him. That's just a theory, though. Again, nobody really knows who killed him and why. Who's to say? But that's an example of how Russian influence operations, even when they're very explicit, like in eastern Ukraine, face a lot of difficulties. It's just inherently hard to get people to do what you want them to do. If you want there's an old saying, if you want good health, you have to do it yourself, something to that effect. If you want it done right, you have to do it yourself. You can't really depend on other people. And proxies tend to be very difficult to work with. The United States had the same problem in Vietnam. You know, there was a pro-Western government in power, but it was very corrupt and inefficient, and there was a major free rider problem. You know, the South Vietnamese government knew that the United States did not want South Vietnam to fall to the communists, so they felt that they could kind of just depend on the U.S. military, that they themselves did not really have to deliver much in terms of good governance or an effective South Vietnamese military. And the result was, well, the result was what we had. You know, the government lacked legitimacy. It did not have the broader support of a good chunk of the enough of the public in order to really sustain itself. And of course, the army of the Republic of South Vietnam, ARVN, was famously ineffective. It got better as the conflict went along, but it was never really able to pull its own weight. You can kind of see something similar in Afghanistan. There's probably a lot of political leaders in Afghanistan who don't really feel they need to reform or fight corruption or etc. because they think the United States just won't let the Afghan government fail. It's a difficult problem to deal with. But the point is that influence operations are never simple or clear-cut. And generally, they pretty quickly encounter diminishing returns. You know, you might be able to get some early returns by exploiting pre-existing tension, but after that, it gets real tricky. Anyway, that's some quick and dirty commentary there.
Influence is hard. People can accept gifts, but they don't want to do favors for you if they can avoid it.
That's a good summary. Yeah, that's pretty much in a nutshell. Is there anything else that caught your eye?
Don't think so. I mean, there was another natural disaster. It seems like we're getting more and more of those lately. I don't know. Hurricane, North Carolina. The only thing that really made me alarmed was obviously it's dangerous for people, but there's a whole bunch of pig farms in North Carolina, and there's a bunch of pig poop. And the hurricane made what is literally a shitstorm, or could. I didn't follow up on that really, and I don't really want to, but I've heard that that's kind of a danger.
Yeah. No, I hadn't heard much about it, but yeah, that would be a problem. I think we did have one. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. So before we dig into that, I wanted to take a look at our handy-dandy country chart. Because we talked a little bit about this 2 weeks ago, the last time we were on. We might ask questions at the start instead of at the end. Mm-hmm. So that people actually have time to answer them. I guess the principal question I would have is, actually pretty similar to the question I had last time, which is to the Brazilians listening. Also, if you're from Brazil listening, hello. For those not following the election down in Brazil, one of the leading candidates is a far-right candidate who is known for some rather colorful politics, shall we say. I was looking on his Wikipedia page, and apparently he's on record as having said a statement that was somewhat in support of sterilizing the poor at one point.
Whoa.
Yeah. So, if you're from Brazil, oh, wait, I was about to say, his name is Jos Bolsonaro, and he was actually stabbed, I think, last week. And he's been in intensive care for a while. He's going to be fine, but he's not going to be able to campaign for the last couple weeks of the election. So I guess my question to the Brazilians then is that stabbing going to impact his chances of winning? And if he does win, will he win outright, or will there be a runoff? Because from what I read, it's not likely that he would win a runoff election. But I'm not sure about that, and I would wager they'd know more about it than I would. So that would be my question to them. So answer at your leisure, you don't have to, but I would definitely be curious on some opinions on that. So
yeah, I mean, at the very least, you could probably say that the stabbing hurt, and he would prefer not to be stabbed, but...
Not a stretch.
Beyond that, I don't know.
Not a stretch. He was in some pain, apparently. Let's see, wanted to have what do you think about the Syrian war now that Turkey actively supports rebels close to their border while provoking Russia? Well, they've been doing that. That's not new. They've definitely been supporting the rebels for a while. It was pretty explicit from the start, and they really weren't fooling anybody. You know, the real question was which rebels were they supporting, because there was some question about the extent of Turkish support for radical rebels. You know, obviously they were supporting the Free Syrian Army. I mean, that was pretty clear-cut from early on in the conflict, but it was Turkish support for groups like HTS, you know, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, and for Islamic State and other extremist Islamists. That was a little less clear-cut, debatable. Let's see, so where they are now, I don't know that they're provoking Russia. In fact, they're probably trying to engage Russia. I've got a whole series on this over on SoundCloud, for anybody who's interested. Someday I'll finish that goddamn episode I'm still working on. But for now, it's that Syria series is all I've got on there. But I kind of get more into that in more detail. But basically, the Turks have been trying to engage the Syrian government, and more so the Russian government, to try to create some kind of understanding, not necessarily a peace agreement, but a kind of mutual understanding about what Syria is going to look like going forward. And one of the things that might have involved is a common front against the Kurds, because both the Syrian government and the Turkish government are not on good terms with the Kurds in their respective countries. The Turks, obviously, because they have an armed militant group, and the PKK, you know, the armed Kurdish militant group in their territory. Among other, that's a whole other political issue we could talk about, but basically they have reasons for being on bad terms with them. The Syrian government doesn't necessarily have bad relations with Kurds based on ethnic conflict like in Turkey. The issue there is more that there is a Kurdish group called the SDF, which is basically a Kurdish group, that controls the good chunk of eastern Syria, and the Syrian government would rather like that territory back at some point. So that could have been the grounds for an entente, you know, a kind of understanding, you know, some kind of agreement. But the United States has more or less committed to protecting the SDF. And since nobody has the power to dislodge the United States, that basically means that eastern area is a no-go, at least for the moment. So that kind of creates a problem for the Turks and the Syrian government then, because that means that the Syrian government, if it wants to reclaim more territory, can't go to eastern Syria. It's going to have to kind of focus on Idlib. That's the only other area where they have any potential. They can't really take on the US, but they could possibly take on the Turks. Turkish military is still very powerful. And if the Syrian government has Russian support, they've got a chance. So there's this game of chicken going on right now in Idlib province, where the Syrian government is saying that they're going to invade and take the province back, but the Turkish government is investing more troops in the observation posts that they have. The Turkish government and Turkish military has observation posts in which the Turkish army is deployed, and that had been set up as the result of a previous de-escalation agreement that was meant to try to maintain a ceasefire there, and the Syrian government had basically agreed to that so they could focus on Islamic State and fighting rebels in the south. But now that those have kind of been cleaned up, they're focusing on the north again. But Turkish troops are still deployed there, and the Turkish military has bolstered those deployments. So it's not really clear if the Syrian army is going to try their luck and actually invade Idlib, in which case there's a very good chance they would have to fight the Turkish army as well, or if they're going to back off at some point. Or maybe the Russians kind of back them and then the Turks maybe back off. It's unclear what the outcome is going to be. This is still very much in play right now. I would bet that the Turks are going to stay, that they're more willing, that they have a credible threat to fight in defense of the Syrian rebels in Idlib, and that the Russians are not going to want to really fight the Turks. You know, the Russians are in Syria to protect the Syrian government, prevent it from being overthrown. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to back them and fighting anybody and everybody to try to reclaim every bit of territory. You know, right now, the Russians' mission in Syria has been successful. They have stopped the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. Anything more than that is extra, and it's not really clear if the Russians are all that interested in investing extra effort, try to go the extra mile to basically reunify and reconstruct Syria, especially if it means a potential conflict with a relatively powerful regional power like Turkey. So the Turks have a lot invested in Idlib province. They've kind of carved that out as their sphere of influence in Syria, and given that they've spent a lot of time and resources trying to build that over the past few years, I don't think they're going to give it up easily, especially given that they have a trump card in the relatively powerful Turkish army. That combined with the Russians' lack of commitment, what I would assume is a lack of commitment. Maybe they'll surprise me, but I don't think they're committed enough to the Syrian government to want to go and help them fight for Idlib province. So I'll wager that in the game of chicken that the Syrian government blinks, and that at the last minute they'll back off. I think an interesting question would be what happens after that. If that does happen, then what does the Syrian government do? Because at that point, they can't retake Idlib province, they can't retake eastern Syria, or at least Syria east of the Euphrates. And at that point, what do they do? Where do they go? And it probably comes down to a negotiated settlement at that point. You know, one made more in earnest than previous attempts, since there is really not much else that can be achieved through armed conflict. The Turks will protect the rebels in Idlib province, but I don't think they would try to really push to expand Idlib province, to expand rebel-held territory at this point, because it doesn't seem like that's a winning game, especially since the Russians would probably intervene to try to counter it. And, you know, there's questions about the U.S. commitment in eastern Syria, who knows, you know, with the Trump administration, but it seems like the U.S. has a nominal commitment to at least protect SDF territory as it stands now. I don't think the U.S. would try to help them expand, but they would probably intervene if anybody tried to seize that territory. So one possible outcome is a negotiated settlement between those three parties. More likely, since there's so many divergent interests that a negotiated settlement would be difficult, more likely it just becomes a frozen conflict. And the conflict basically just freezes as it is now, and everybody tries to focus on rebuilding. That's a guess, though. Again, who's to say? There's a lot of different variables at play, and if any one of them changes, that could change the calculus. But roughly, that's my reading on Syria. Those are my thoughts on the Syrian war, given the current status quo. Let's see, over the past 10 years, the number of entities that the government has used sanctions on has dramatically increased. Is the United States using sanctions too aggressively? That's a fair argument. You know, I've read some people making that. You know, the idea is that if you use, the big one is SWIFT banking sanctions. You know, the argument is that if you use financial sanctions too much, then you create an incentive. You create uncertainty in the status quo financial system and create an incentive to resort to alternative financial systems, which basically gives an incentive to create alternative financial systems. In which case, you know, the power of those sanctions is watered down with time. So yes, it's true that if you use sanctions too much, then you basically just empower alternatives such that over the long term, your financial sanctions don't mean as much. That said, Swift banking is so ubiquitous in international finance that it would be hard to create an alternative that would be economically viable. The Swift banking system is actually not based in the United States. It's actually based in Europe. So when the United States places sanctions, Swift banking sanctions on a given country or economic entity of some kind, they're not actually stopping those entities from using Swift banking. They're actually threatening the Swift banking system in Europe with sanctions if they don't implement the sanctions that the United States wants. So it's actually kind of 1 degree removed from U.S. sanctions. So that kind of reveals the economic power of the United States. Even if you set up an alternative banking system like SWIFT, the United States is so important to international finance and international economic activity that if you did actually become large enough to rival SWIFT, you would be subject to the same credible economic threats from the United States that SWIFT is, and you would then in turn have very good incentive to implement sanctions in the same way SWIFT does on behalf of the United States government. So you could also argue that U.S. economic might is sufficiently large that even if the U.S. does kind of abuse that sanctions ability, that there's not really a credible threat that could arise from an alternative. There probably will be an alternative that rises eventually, but it will probably be too small to really viably threaten SWIFT and existing financial institutions as a viable alternative. Certainly, I think it's not a bad idea to kind of be more selective with financial sanctions, because if you do abuse it too much, then a lot of activity will be driven underground. And given that it's that activity that you're basically targeting, that activity that's propping up a given government or economic activity, sanctions become ineffective at that point. Because, unless you're willing to invest a lot in police powers to investigate, who's moving money where and whatnot, to try to figure out what's going on in that underground economy, which is very difficult, most likely sanctions will not have the impact you want. There's a number of examples of businesses and governments like the Sudan and Iran who have shirked sanctions using black market alternatives. And the longer sanctions are in place, the stronger those black market institutions become and the more reliable they become for those governments and economic actors. So, yes, you can bring a lot of pressure to bear with economic sanctions, but just leaning on them over a long period of time basically negates them. Doesn't mean you can't still bring a lot of pressure to bear, but it's probably not going to be decisive, especially if you don't get that early knockout win. Short to medium term, they can inflict enough pain to make a country kind of knuckle under and give concessions. But if they're not giving concessions over the long term, they probably never will, unless there's some political blow-up or something. They'll probably have sufficiently adjusted to reach a new equilibrium that they can tolerate, at which point you're going to have to find a new way to bring pressure, or stop bringing pressure, one or the other. So that's kind of a meandering answer there. This might be a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything we talk about. I'm sure you've noticed. I have a stronger background in some areas than others, so this is meant to be more of a discussion. I just like talking about economics and current events and whatnot, and I can bring some background to give some context on that, but it's meant to be more interactive. People in chat, if I say something stupid, ignorant, or biased, I encourage chat to pipe in and give feedback on that. Because I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, and I will kind of see that, and I'll be able to correct. So, if I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't pretend to be an expert in everything we talk about. I'm not a proselytizer. I'm not here to convince you of one thing or another. I'm just trying to give context and background to some of these topics.
Yeah, and just to clue in a bunch of viewers here, because the stream has blown up a little bit over the past couple weeks. We used to have, say, average 200 to 400 viewers on a Sunday like this, and we're rocking close to 900 right now. So there are a lot of new people who are here, and they hear a mysterious voice in the background talking about something or something, and I'm not talking all the time because I try to give you space to complete a thought here or there. But this is a real life friend of mine. He is not a recording. No, he is not on C-SPAN. Yes, he has a podcast. And this is, like he said, an interactive discussion where what he's addressing is based on the questions from the chat. So if he addresses something, someone asked this, Fuzzy Court is passing these along. Please be respectful, or I will time you out or ban you. We already got to time out someone who was hassling in the chat. Let's keep it respectful here. If you have constructive criticism, we welcome that. Constructive criticism is the heckin' best. Excuse my language.
Let's see.
Now, some people mistake my silence for a lack of interest. I was defending a one-base Protoss cannon rush and trying to let you finish your thought. That's why I wasn't talking.
Yeah, you're busy.
There are lots of cannon rushes these days. It's tough. It's actually a new era because they added a new building to StarCraft that is also a static structure. It's called the Shield Battery. And as the name suggests, it is a battery for the shields of Protoss stuff. Which means instead of making more bases and more army, they can just make more of these batteries, and they only have, say, 5 units, but they never run out of batteries. So they can just beat you up with 5 units, and people get very upset. But you can do this up to a pro level. It's kind of amazing.
Oh, pretty handy. It's been a long time since I played StarCraft, so I'm not that familiar with the mechanics. Even when I was playing, I was bad at it.
Yeah, you said you were in the map editor or something recently, though,
Oh!
right?
Yeah, I was trying and failing at that for a couple months. Yeah, we could talk about that sometime. Yeah, there's some stories there.
No, he does not have a Twitch stream. Yet.
Oh god, no. I would not want to inflict my mug on the internet. Bad enough my voice.
Well, there are different mugs, coffee mugs. You could just put a picture of a mug.
I did play co-op for a while on StarCraft. That was kind of fun.
Nice. It's actually about a third of the community of people who play StarCraft 2 is co-op these days.
Oh, cool.
It's like 1/3 co-op, 1/3 1v1, 1/3 arcade and team games.
Oh, wow. They've added a lot of diversity, haven't they?
Yeah.
Probably pretty smart. Now, let's see. StarCraft commentary aside, which you're going to be a lot better at that than I will.
Yeah, well, I've done 2 weeks with no days off of StarCraft, so they can't really complain at this point.
Oh god, have you not had a day off for 2 weeks?
No, but I'm gonna take a day off tomorrow, and no one's gonna stop me. Okay? Great. Great.
Don't hurt yourself, man.
It's okay. I'm tough.
That's true. You do exercise. I could probably learn a thing or two.
I jump up and down and run places and pick stuff up.
Sometimes I stand up. Does that count?
Yes, it does. That's your daily struggle against gravity.
Sometimes gravity wins that struggle.
Well, it always wins. It's a matter of when it wins. And when you resist it.
So the next one was... What was the next one? Oh, sanction. Can you comment on the status of the quote-unquote war on cash? In 2016, Narendra Modi demonetized the 500 and 1,000 rupee bills, more than 80% of the economy's cash value. I remember that. The stated goal was to reduce the flow of money in black markets, but it seemed to be wholly ineffective and mainly hurt the poor. Will other countries try similar demonetization experiments? And would this cause migration into currencies out of the control of governments? Wink, wink. Yes, cryptocurrencies. Yeah, this was Oh, yeah, as he says, in 2016, the Modi government wanted to try to fight corruption, which there's quite a bit of in India. I don't know if we have anybody from India listening, but perhaps you could, they could tell you about some of the corruption in India. But a lot of that corruption involves cash, black market, exchange, suitcases of cash, that kind of thing. So it was thought that one of the ways that you could crack down on that is by removing small bills, or at least what would the name be? Remonetizing, basically. And so the idea was if you could take a lot of that currency out of the markets, then you could put a significant damper on the black market and corruption. And it just did not work. The people it was meant to target were able to get around it. They basically were able to launder that money in various ways. So they took a hit, but black market actors were able to kind of recover and get around it. The principal people affected were small traders. If you're a small-time merchant in a city or a province or what have you, you do a lot of business in cash, and it was extremely inconvenient to suddenly have a bunch of your cash, not only the cash that you trade in, but your cash savings, suddenly be rendered worthless. Well, it wasn't rendered worthless overnight, but you were faced with the prospect of it becoming worthless, and so you had to go to the bank and deposit it and try to get new currency or figure out some alternative arrangement. And that put a significant dent in economic growth that year, because so much trade in India is small traders like that, and they could not engage in normal business under those circumstances. And some people argue that the Indian economy still hasn't quite fully recovered from that. So let's see, that's rough characterization of what happened. Yes, it was, and in fact it hurt the poor. Will other countries try similar demonetization experiments? I don't think so. And not just because the Indian experiment didn't really go particularly well. For one, if you're a corrupt politician, why would you do that? It's against your interest, and the countries that could be best served by any kind of anti-corruption measures are the ones where it's the least likely, because the corrupt people are in power and don't want to do that. Or if they do it, they do it in a way that is not inconvenient to themselves. More to the point, demonetization is difficult administratively. It's not easy to do, to try to arbitrarily declare, okay, we're going to remove X amount of currency below a certain value, currency denominated under a certain value, and replace it either with digital currency or some other new currency. It's expensive, and a lot of poorer countries just don't have the money for that. Even India, you could argue, probably shouldn't have done it just on those grounds, because it's not as though the Indian government has a ton of resources to work with. The Modi government has been known for pushing schemes like that. They've been more willing to experiment and spend money on things like that to try to initiate some kind of change, be it in society or the economy. And that's to their credit. It takes some political capital and some risk tolerance to do something like that, but it doesn't always work out. And some countries just don't have that, don't have the resources or don't have the risk tolerance to kind of push policy experimentation like that. And as for whether this would cause people to move into cryptocurrencies, probably not. I would expect it to make people... I mean, if a measure like this did shake confidence in an established currency enough that they would want to move out of their country's currency, they would probably move into safe currencies. So they would move into established reserve currencies like the Swiss franc or the Japanese yen, US dollar, British pound, the euro, what have you. Something that's established, or gold, or some commodity or something. Commodities are a little less convenient though, so probably a currency, but possibly gold. But the point is, cryptocurrencies are not really safe enough to be a viable alternative currency. When Zimbabwe suffered from hyperinflation, people just defaulted to the dollar because that was just safe and established. So if something similar happened in a country that tried to implement a demonetization scheme that went wrong, there would probably be a similar phenomena. That's kind of what's happening now in Argentina. I don't know if we have any Argentines listening, but maybe they could talk a little bit about how the economy is doing in Argentina right now. It would be interesting to get a first-person perspective. Obviously, it's struggling, but a first-person perspective is always interesting and useful. But in Argentina, the economy is struggling. There's a lot of problems with inflation in particular. And in previous cases where that's happened, where the economy crashed in Argentina because of either inflation or a debt crisis or what have you, generally people defaulted to dollars because it was considered a safe, reliable currency. So I would expect that to happen more so than cryptocurrencies getting a big windfall. Let's see, what do you think of the US Senate election for Texas that's coming up? Yeah, I live in Texas, so I've heard a lot about it. I'm still not real convinced that Beto O'Rourke can beat Ted Cruz. I know the polls have been narrowing a bit. Supposedly it's a lot closer than any recent Senate election in Texas for some time. But I just don't think he could win. I don't think he fundamentally can just overcome that Texas conservatism. There's a lot of people here that just vote straight ticket. And if you don't, maybe I should explain that. If you don't know what straight ticket means, to vote straight ticket means that you just, on an election ballot, tick all of the candidates under one party. You don't even necessarily care or know who you're voting for, just, oh, they're the given candidate, so you just tick that box. There's a lot of straight ticket voting in Texas for the Republican Party. Used to be for the Democratic Party, but then there was a big shift in the 70s, and now it's the Republican Party. We shifted from one party state to another. Such is political culture in Texas. That's not to say that there is not some political competition, you know, that there is political diversity. It tends to... Basically, the urban centers tend to be more left and vote more Democrat, and then the smaller cities and towns and rural areas tend to vote more Republican. But generally, Texas is pretty solidly conservative. So Beto O'Rourke might be getting a boost because there's a lot of people on the right who are not sold on Trump. You know, there's a lot of conservatives that love Trump and swear by him, but there's also a lot of guys, especially more in the suburbs, who are conservative, who don't really like his style of politics or some of his policy positions. So I think Beto O'Rourke might be getting some votes from them that are helping him. But I'm still skeptical that he's going to be able to get enough to push him over the edge. Definitely it's a closer election than it might have been otherwise, or than any recent such election, but we'll see. You know, we'll see how much more it narrows, and if maybe he can get ahead in the polls and maybe surprise people on election day. But for now, I would say no, you probably won't win. The numbers I don't think are quite there. There's some disenchantment among Republicans with Trump in Texas suburbs, but I don't think there's enough evidence. I don't think there's enough evidence yet to suggest those people will be enough in number to swing the election for Beto O'Rourke.
He's getting the soccer mom vote.
Yeah, he's getting the disenchanted soccer mom vote. Yeah, that's kind of what Democrats are hoping for more broadly in the upcoming midterm elections in the U.S., that there's going to be enough disenchanted conservative voters who are willing to switch or abstain, that they can kind of pick up the seats they need to get at least the House of Representatives, maybe even the Senate. Senate's a long shot, because there's a lot more incumbent Democrats in the Senate running than there are Republican incumbents, and a lot of the incumbent Democrats are in states that I think voted for Trump in the presidential election in 2016. So that's a tough spot to be in. Most likely they won't get control of the Senate. But House of Representatives is quite possible. Still kind of early, well, I guess it's not early going, but there's a lot that can happen in local elections like that. Or, well, maybe not local, but House of Representatives elections tend to be a little more volatile. So we'll see what happens. House of Representatives, probable. Senate, probably not. And Beto O'Rourke, probably not. It's possible, but the numbers are still a bit of a stretch. Let's see, in 2002, President George W. Bush withdrew from the 72 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and subsequently, NATO has been utilizing missile shields in many of its member nations since. could you comment on how you think this may have had an impact on U.S.-Russian relations today? I don't think it's a defining characteristic, but it didn't help. It didn't help either. You know, there's this running myth, and that the United States kind of stabbed Russia in the back after the Cold War by expanding into Eastern Europe, and that's kind of only half true. It's true that James Baker, whom I believe was Secretary of State under the first Bush administration, it's true that Baker made a handshake agreement, basically an informal agreement with the Soviet leadership that basically in exchange for the Soviets pulling out of Eastern Europe and allowing the reunification of Germany, the United States would refrain from expanding NATO into Central and Eastern Europe. That was basically the deal that ended the Cold War. So then some people, especially in Russia, were very upset later on when NATO ended up expanding into Eastern Europe anyway. And I think that's more the crux of the tension between the West and Russia right now. There is a sense among certain Russians, especially nationalists, that the West stabbed them in the back and is aggressively pushing the borders of the EU and NATO up into Russia's sphere of influence, and that the West is to blame for current tensions for not respecting that sphere of influence more. So I would argue that that issue is more the crux of tensions between Russia and the West, and the relationship between Russia and the West right now than the ABM treaty. But the fact that the Bush administration did abandon the ABM treaty is an example of kind of the haughty attitude that the Western leaders, especially American leaders, have taken towards Russia historically. You know, there was an attitude that Russia was kind of a weak, dependent power, and that they didn't really need to worry that much about catering to Russian concerns. In fairness, there was broadly an attitude in the 1990s that, you know, democracy and capitalism had basically carried the day after the Cold War, and that eventually Russia would integrate with the West, and that Russia and the West were not at any kind of strategic odds. And with that attitude, a lot of strategic agreements were not really were kind of considered redundant. You know, Russia and the West were not allies in the 90s, but it was thought that at some point in the future they would be close cooperative partners. That was the future rather than a return to tension. So that also, I think, played a role in the fact that the West kind of didn't care about Russia. It was thought that they didn't need to care about Russia because they and Russia were on the same page. It was thought that Russia would be a partner in future and that they would cooperate going forward once Russia started to integrate into certain either existing Western institutions or new institutions that would be created. Obviously, there would be controversy over the prospect of Russia joining the European Union because of its size. You know, the European Union is largely medium to small nations. So Russia, if it joined, would have disproportionate power. So it's quite possible that if Russia had tried to join the European Union, that they would have been rejected because of paranoia and concern amongst existing EU members about disproportionate Russian influence. But an alternative could have been something like an association agreement or a free trade deal or some other alternative institution that could have been designed to try to alleviate concerns amongst Western European and Central European actors that would have allowed Russia to integrate more fully. So, yes, leaving the anti-ballistic missile treaty definitely kind of gave the Russians the impression that maybe the West didn't care and that the West was just aggressively pushing their interests anywhere and everywhere without any concern for the Russian government. But on the other hand, I don't think that was a decisive factor. I don't think that was a critical moment in the relationship's history.
Must consume.
Let's see. So then Mitt Romney last week said we are in an actual constitutional crisis at the moment. Is this the general consensus or is this controversial? I would say it's controversial. I don't think it's a consensus. There's some people who have come out and said there's a constitution. I actually did have notes on this, come to think of it. This is one of the things I was going to bring up. for those who aren't familiar with what this is referring to, a couple weeks ago, there was an article published in the New York Times, supposedly written by someone in the Trump administration, in which they asserted that people in the Trump administration, basically administrative officials, bureaucrats, what have you, are going out of their way to influence and interfere with Donald Trump's decision-making process within the administration to try to mitigate some of his more egregious impulses, such as they are, if they are. And so the argument there that arose then is over whether that represents a de facto quote-unquote administrative coup, whether or not the civilian authority is being circumscribed illegally so in the administration. And it's a tough call, but I don't really think that's quite what it amounts to. I mean, this is not it is not unconstitutional per se for bureaucrats to try to influence a president's decision making, and it's not even really that unusual, historically speaking, for bureaucrats to try to color their advice in such a way that kind of pushes a president towards a certain outcome. That's pretty standard bureaucratic influence peddling within any given administration. And it even happens inadvertently, because there's such a thing as institutional bias that causes institutional actors to push given perspectives or biases in their advice inherently without even thinking about it. Just because that's the way they perceive the world, they give advice in a way that kind of colors the way it's presented and pushes inadvertently a president towards given decisions. That kind of goes back to the old debate about the blob, the foreign policy blob, such as it was colorfully referred to in the Obama administration. That there's a lot of bias within the foreign policy establishment in Washington that causes them to think in ways that push them towards certain outcomes, rather than being more, shall we say, more critical in their thinking, more creative in their policy proposals and thinking. So that's not necessarily problematic. But for bureaucrats to kind of come out and openly say that they're influencing a president and trying to stop his policy making or, stymie some of his policy preferences, that in itself, to a degree, legitimizes bureaucratic interference and delegitimizes civilian leadership. And that kind of is more where the problem lies. In a liberal democratic political system, it's very important that civilians be the paramount leaders. Civilian leadership is the representative of the will of the people, and it's from that the government derives its legitimacy amongst the public. So if the public begins to suspect that's not happening, that their will is not representative in government, because bureaucrats are preventing the civilian leadership from expressing in policy the preferences and will of the public, that could delegitimize the government. And when a government becomes delegitimized, then the result is generally political instability. And we've talked before on here that the secret, so to speak, to U.S. economic power and military power is not so much their free market institutions or the U.S. military. It's actually the stability of political institutions in the United States. That those institutions and their stability and the broader public's acceptance and observance of the prerequisite institutional and political norms needed to maintain those institutions, all of that is what underlies everything else that makes the United States so successful as a country, economically, politically, and militarily.
So, it might be worth pointing out, just to interject, what you mean by liberal democratic, because we likely have a lot of United States viewers who hear the word liberal and think that means leftist.
Triggered.
Which does not necessarily mean leftist liberal in the classical sense, not in the modern news media sense.
Yeah, classical liberalism in a nutshell is democratic politics, political pluralism, rule of law, generally free markets, or something resembling market economics anyway. Roughly, that's what it is. Just classical liberalism is sort of the bedrock of all Western political institutions. And that's what I refer to when I say liberal democratic. Democratic institutions as they derive from political philosophy and thought stemming from the Renaissance and Enlightenment thinking. So thank you for pointing that out. I try to catch that when I can, to point that out.
We got some viewers who were like, I knew he was a liberal. He came out and said it. Ha!
No, not quite. Not that kind of liberal. Let's see, so... right, so if liberal democratic institutions are called into question and lose their legitimacy because people think the bureaucracy is overreaching in its power and blocking civilian leadership, that could be a very real problem and undermine political institutions in the United States, create political instability, and in turn negatively impact the U.S. economy and the ability of the U.S. to exert power and influence in the world, which I know not everybody would think would be a bad thing, but regardless of whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, that's what would happen. So, what was I on anyway? I was explaining the background. Is it a constitutional crisis? It's not a constitutional crisis, but what I just explained is why it's problematic, so to speak. That's more where the issue is. And I'm not even really sure why the author of that article wrote it. Assuming it's legit, what did they gain by publishing that? And I'm not real sure on what he was going for. I was a little confused by that. It seems like publishing an article like that would only make it more difficult to try to rein in Donald Trump's personality, some of his more erratic policy pronouncements, if that is indeed what's happening. So I'm not sure what's gained by that. It could be that it's just meant to antagonize the president. Maybe somebody there just wants the president to be more, not be more erratic, but to push more for his policies that thus far have kind of been sidelined a bit. So maybe somebody published that article as a kind of false flag to antagonize the president and get him to clamp down on some of the people in his administration who are opposed to certain policies. Maybe it's not a false flag, but the author is part of a cohort that is getting desperate, and they're trying to kind of give a cry for help. Basically, they're saying that we can't quite keep a hold on it, so we kind of need some assistance. On the other hand, it might just be that it's just legit straight. Somebody in the administration was worried that the public would lose faith in the government because they were concerned about Donald Trump and some of his erratic behavior on Twitter being generally the case in point. In that case, it may be that they're not worried about backlash from Trump. It may be that they're so confident that they can control the president, or at least contain the president, that even the fallout from publishing this article doesn't really concern them. So those are different possibilities as to how and why somebody would publish that. I don't know, anybody's guess really, but it was a bit perplexing for somebody to come out and do that, especially not long before a major midterm election. But in so much as it sets a bad precedent for the bureaucracy trying to challenge a president, that's not great. I would add, though, that it might not be a bad thing if the things they're doing are very mundane. If they're going full conspiracy and trying to really sideline through legal or illegal means the president's will, that would be a problem. Not quite a constitutional crisis, but problematic. But if they're doing just very minor things, and the president is just getting sidelined because he can't catch them, because he's not politically experienced enough to kind of see it, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In that case, the issue is not so much people sidelining the president, it's more the president just lacking political acumen, and that's easily fixed. You just have to find somebody who reflects your policy preferences, but who is sufficiently experienced to be able to catch that, to understand when when bureaucrats and administrative officials are trying to kind of steer you towards given outcomes. In that case, that's not so much an indictment on the administration as it is on the individual. The individual experience and ability to exert policy preferences and control and manage a large administration, as is the case with the President of the United States. That would be the best case. That would be that's the best case scenario, that they're doing just very minor things and that it's not actually a significant threat to established political norms. You know, if they can kind of contain the worst excesses of a potentially erratic president, I don't know if he is or he isn't, because I don't know him, I'm not in the administration. But if they can contain him, if he is being erratic, without violating institutional democratic norms and certainly laws, that would be kind of the best outcome. We'll see, though. It's, again, without being in the administration, it's hard to tell, you know, what's accurate and what's not, so who's to say. But I would not argue, to get back to the question, I would not argue that it's a constitutional crisis. I would argue that it's not, and that it certainly is, it raises questions. It raises problematic questions, but not yet at the level of a constitutional crisis. Caesar has not crossed the Rubicon. We're not there yet. Can you comment on the situation regarding the South African government grabbing land from white farmers without compensation and the open hostility towards the white population from certain government officials? I was wondering when somebody would ask about this, because this has kind of been stewing for a while, for about a year. And it's only now that it's kind of getting media attention outside South Africa. So this is my excuse then to talk a little bit about South African politics. Basically, after apartheid ended, the dominant political force in South Africa was the ANC, the African National Congress, I believe is what ANC stands for. And the ANC was all about, for one, black empowerment, but also, what's the word I want? Reconciliation. You know, they did not want the politics of post-apartheid Africa to be racially antagonistic. They wanted to try to create a South Africa in which there could be social justice, in which the African population, you know, well, the black African population. Some trivia for you: white people born in Africa are Africans. So if you want to refer to actual black Africans, they are, you kind of have to refer to them as either black Africans or to their respective ethnicity.
Yeah, it's nationality versus ethnicity.
Yeah. So the post-apartheid ANC wanted post-apartheid politics in South Africa to uplift the black African population of South Africa, but to do so in a way that did not antagonize the white population. They wanted a rainbow coalition, basically, and for South Africa's economy and for social justice policies to be pursued in equanimity, basically. And that worked for a while, especially with the commodity boom in the mid-aughts, where the South African economy was really able to kind of take off for a while. But after the commodity boom ended, in fact went bust, commodity prices went bust after the '08 financial crisis, that created some difficulties. You know, all of a sudden, all this money coming in wasn't there anymore, and these patronage networks that had emerged in the ANC started to kind of crumple under the pressure. So, well, I guess I should comment on the patronage networks. The ANC became very corrupt, basically. There was a guy named Jacob, I think his name was Jacob Zuma, who kind of inherited the party from, oh hell, what's his name? Famous South African peace guy, what's his... Nelson Mandela, there we go. Zuma inherited the ANC from Mandela, and he was much more of a political operator than he was a kind of big picture thinker like Mandela was. And, you know, he's famous for a number of political scandals in South Africa. I think the most memorable and my personal favorite was the swimming pool that he allegedly built with public money at his personal compound that was built, not as a swimming pool. His justification was that it was built, let me see if to help with fire hazards, to act as a water reserve in case of fire. Nobody really bought that. I don't think he convinced anybody with that. But that corruption really hurt the ANC's image. And that, in conjunction with the economic downturn, really started to put political pressure on the ANC, and that led to the emergence of the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is a political opposition group that emerged in, you know, roughly 2010, you know, kind of around there. Maybe somebody from South Africa can kind of elaborate on that, kind of correct me on that. But their policy was predicated on emphasizing social justice. They wanted the South African government to really push hard to right the wrongs of apartheid. Specifically, they wanted a lot more economic redistribution. And their argument was that one of their arguments was that the land redistribution program that had been set up after apartheid ended was moving too slowly. They wanted it to be sped up considerably. Now, the land redistribution program that had been set up was meant to try to give land to the impoverished black African population, because a significant percentage of land in South Africa is owned by white farmers, or at least white owners. And part of the reason for that is because a lot of the native tribes in the region over the course of the 20th century had been pushed off their land and isolated in townships, which allowed for white investors to basically buy and own most of the land. So because that was seen as historically unfair, for one, and also in order to try to deal with the poverty in the townships, the land redistribution program was created to try to get more of the black African population back onto land of their own so that they could become farmers and have a self-sustaining livelihood to be able to produce for themselves. And obviously that's difficult, because with most of the land owned by white farmers of one sort or another, you have to buy the land from the white farmers and then give it over to the black African population, whoever it is that you deem to be, whoever it was that applies for it and meets the qualifications. But the process was very slow, because a lot of people didn't want to sell, or if they did want to sell, they would haggle, and the bureaucracy just dragged things out interminably. So it was a very slow process, and it was not moving nearly fast enough for people who wanted to help deal with poverty now. Poverty is a big problem in South Africa and has been. And the pace of reform, not only the land redistribution program, but just the policy of dealing anti-poverty programs, basically, were just taking too long to deliver any real results. So the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, jumped in and just demanded that the government speed up the process. And one of the ways they wanted to be sped up is to remove a provision in the law that does not allow for appropriation without compensation. One of the big problems is that if you want to buy land, if the government wants to get land for redistribution, it had to buy it, and the process of buying it, again, took up a lot of time. By removing this provision, the government could just take the land and hand it over. So it cuts out a number of steps and makes it a lot easier. That's the gist of the proposal. Now, as far as I know, this actually hasn't happened yet. So people sometimes talk about it like it's already going on and land is being seized. As far as I know, the law has not been changed yet, and there has been no land seized without compensation as of yet, correspondingly. But it's probably going to pass, because the ANC is facing a lot of pressure from the EFF, and it's not clear that they're going to be able to keep their position in power without shifting to the left on that issue, shifting towards the EFF position, because the EFF is garnering more and more political support. Again, poverty is endemic in South Africa, and government action and the free market, the state of the economy over the past 20-some years, basically since apartheid, has just not really put a big dent in it. And that's kind of the crux of the tension there. What can we do to alleviate poverty in South Africa? And, whenever free markets or a government or what have you fails to deliver on that count, invariably more radical actors step in offering solutions. So you could say this is basically South Africa's manifestation of the populist wave that's been sweeping over global politics over the past 20-some years. This is basically their equivalent of that. Now, as for, again, it'll probably pass, but, there are questions about what the impact of that would be, whether or not it's legal, constitutional, etc. Obviously, the first thing that happens is that the investor confidence would be hurt. The attractiveness of owning land in South Africa is significantly mitigated if you think that there's a risk that the South African government could arbitrarily seize it. And that being the case, there could be a significant tail-off in investment, not only from outside South Africa, but from within South Africa into the agricultural sector, which could have an impact over the long term on productivity in South African agriculture. I don't think it would be as bad as Zimbabwe. One of the reasons Zimbabwe's economy collapsed is because the government went out of its way to seize and redistribute white-owned land, which pretty much crushed the agricultural sector there and the broader economy. It doesn't seem like that's kind of what the South African government is offering. You know, it seems like they're more interested, not so much in mass appropriation, but expedited appropriation. You know, the new guy, basically the guy that replaces Jacob Zuma as head of the ANC and the head of the current government, has said that yes, there will be some appropriations, but we're going to compensate people as much as possible. It's not going to be just sheer Zimbabwe-style appropriation wherever possible. You know, we're not going to do it like that. But there's hypothetically no reason they can't do it like that, and that's kind of the reason for the anxiety. And that's why people in South Africa have been much more loud about complaining about this pending shift in policy. You know, if what the South African government is true and they're not going to be radical, they're not going to use this as an excuse for Zimbabwe-style expropriation, the economy will probably take a dent in the short to medium term, but it won't be a catastrophe. On the other hand, you know, if they do end up abusing the power, then yeah, that'll be a big problem. I don't think they will, but anybody's guess, really. Who's to say? Let's see. So that's just some comment on that. Open hostility towards the white population from certain government officials. It was hell-bound to happen sooner or later. You know, it was probably inevitable that economic growth would not be sufficient after apartheid to really generate the kind of gains that the black African population in South Africa was really hoping for. You know, there was a real hope that the poverty of the townships would end not long after apartheid, and that there would be maybe not full equality, but you know, significant improvement in the state of the black African population, and it didn't really pan out. And given that that was probably inevitable, it was probably going to be inevitable in turn that there was going to be racially antagonized politics in South Africa. So the question then is not so much, you know, is this going to happen? You know, how did this come to happen? Is this permanent? It probably will have a lasting impact. It probably will be a lasting feature of South African politics. I think the question more is, can establishment political forces provide a sufficient valve for that political pressure to prevent the radicalization of South African politics writ large? If they can do that, then South Africa could kind of manage this. People might not like the policies that the South African government engages in, but that might just be the price of political stability in South Africa. You know, there's a huge gap between the haves and have-nots in South Africa, and given the history and, you know, the history of colonialism and the racial antagonism, I don't know that you can really get out of it without offering some significant. I don't think you can get out of the current political tension without some significant political changes in policy. And again, if the present political forces can manage that and channel it such that it can be done legally, constitutionally, and without excesses or abuses of power or etc., then it's manageable, and South African politics can kind of stabilize over the long term, and the South African economy can be given the time it needs to grow sufficiently to sufficiently give opportunities to the black African population, such that they feel that they're being given opportunities, advancing, etc., such that they feel that they're being given a fair shake in South African society. But if they can't manage it, then things can get crazy. You know, all of the basic requirements are there for major political instability and low intensity conflict. So, you know, if the political forces that be mismanage it, there could be significant violence with corresponding detriment to the South African economy and political culture and long-term prospects generally. But I don't know enough about South African politics and political actors to know which is more likely, which is the more likely outcome. You'd have to talk to somebody more in tune with South African politics and history to kind of get that prediction. But that would be what I would watch, to see how the South African, specifically the ANC, it's going to be the ANC. I would watch how the ANC manages the political challenge posed by the economic freedom fighters. And based on how they manage that over the next 5 to 10 years, I think then could draw a conclusion about what the future of South Africa is going to look like. But until then, I can only really speculate. And that's what I've said thus far is about as much as I can say on it, given what I know. That's kind of another meandering answer. I hope that made sense.
That's what we do here.
I apologize if not, if I ever give an unsatisfactory answer. Feel free to get in chat and ask again or elaborate or what have you, and I'll be happy to return to it. Let's see. So the next one was, will World War III soon happen or never happen, and who would start it?
Ooh, we've talked about this one a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing to look at here is you can't 100% say whether or not there will be one, but you can look at the trends in how global violence has been shifting over time. And per capita, that means per person in the world has become less and less violent over time, from prehistoric times to current times. We have great media coverage of the violence that happens. Like, you can watch live video of the nasty things that are happening in the world. But per person, there are a lot of people who are very far from direct conflict, and the world is a pretty safe place. And one of the things that they've guessed at in terms of a reason why this has been happening is because as people's quality of life goes up, their willingness to put their life on the line to fight and die for a country goes down. Why would I lay down my life for this country when I can just sit in my couch and be comfortable for 85 years? It's pretty hard to motivate people to do that, but if your conditions are really poor, it's pretty easy to think of lots of reasons to fight. Conditions are pretty good for a lot of places around the world right now.
Yeah, there's definitely tensions in the world. But if I had to make a prediction, again, like Neuro said, you can't be 100% sure. But if I had to make a prediction, I would say that it's pretty unlikely. I would say probably not. Because fundamentally, there's not really... The issues that are at the heart of current international tensions are not really sufficiently high stakes to fight a war over, to fight a major war over. Economic tension between China and the United States, some of the geopolitical tension between Russia and the West. Those are tensions that could escalate, but it's not the kind of thing that you start lobbing nukes over. Russia and the West will probably compete more in the political sphere in Eastern Europe than Russia's near abroad. But I don't think they would want to do so with conventional militaries. It's just costly and needlessly destructive.
Now we war with memes.
Yeah, pretty much. And China and the U.S. are more dealing with their issues through tariffs, and you can argue about the wisdom of that, but I don't think it's going to escalate into general conflict. So yes, there are tensions, but they're not really all that bad in the grand scheme of things. More tense than things were in the 90s for sure, but we're still nowhere near the Cold War. This ain't that bad. This is still pretty manageable. Can it ever happen? That side of the question, yeah, for sure, it can still happen. I mean, the most likely long-term outcome for human civilization is that we accidentally destroy each other in a nuclear exchange. That'll probably happen before the next ice age, before a comet wipes everybody out, before climate change, burns out the planet or whatever. Whatever your prospective long-term apocalypse is, the most likely outcome is actually still that the world blows itself up. that the human race blows itself up. It's just too easy. You know, this is one of the things that non-proliferation people talk about. You know, there are people who, I should explain that. Non-proliferation people, what I mean by that is people who campaign to mitigate against the spread of nuclear weapons to new states and the mitigation of current stockpiles of nuclear weapons. And their argument for that is that so long as you have nuclear weapons, there's always a non-zero chance that they will be accidentally used. And so long as that probability of nuclear weapons being accidentally used and possibly sparking a nuclear exchange, so long as that probability is non-zero, then over time, over the length of time, eventually it's going to happen. It may be a low probability at any given time, but over the long term, it's inevitable. And given that the stakes are so high, given that the stakes are human civilization, the non-proliferation argument is that if you don't want the human race to blow itself up, you have to get rid of nuclear weapons at some point, or at least control them to a sufficient degree. So in that sense, World War III, in so much as it's a nuclear exchange, is inevitable. You know, somebody is going to do something stupid at some point. There's going to be a geopolitical miscalculation or something. But in the short to medium term, given what I know now about the state of the world, it doesn't seem likely. You know, unless somebody does something just egregiously stupid, probably not. And as for who would start it, I have no idea. It's anybody's guess. You know, over the long term, it's impossible to predict. So, you know, it could be anybody. You never know what kind of political or economic changes could happen in the long term to change the fundamental underlying calculus of international relations. So who's to say? In the short term, you know, again, I don't think it's likely in the short to medium term that there would be World War III. If there were, I guess you're asking me, if there were, what would be the most likely perpetrator, the most likely instigator? That's a tough call. I would say the most likely case would be a miscalculation. And maybe in, you know, it's so hard. I mean, you could say in the Ukraine, you could say something like the West going all out to try to get the Ukraine into the EU and NATO and expelling Russia influence, and then maybe somehow NATO forces end up clashing with some little green men in eastern Ukraine. And that could precipitate a conflict, but that would require a series of, everything would have to go wrong, because that would have to escalate from a clash to a general commitment of Russian and NATO conventional militaries to nuclear weapons being used, to a general nuclear exchange. And at every step of that way, the most likely outcome is people say, oh wait, this is stupid, this ends badly, let's de-escalate. So you would need to have everything go wrong in that case. But hypothetically, something like the Eastern Ukraine, I don't know, maybe something like a coup in China. Maybe if the People's Liberation Army throws the government out and takes control, and maybe they launch some hyper-militaristic campaign of expansion in Asia, but you know, that's extremely unlikely. We've talked a bit about why before. Xi Jinping has gone very far out of his way to get the military under his thumb. It's been a part of his rise to power.
Another thing that's really important to talk about too is the difference between posturing and campaigning, and how a lot of times we're talking about, quote, aggressive plays, like tariffs. Ooh, tariffs, aggressive. It's a trade-based play, and a lot of these games where you're trying to get the upper hand on your rivals and whatnot is done through violence less often because of the nature of zero-sum games versus positive-sum games. And you also have to factor in, too, the lessons that we learned from the 2 world wars. It's like those are the 2 best documented major conflicts in the history of humanity, and the cost of the wars was very clear in terms of human life and resources and all that, and it really changed the way that the world operates. And if you think about it, too, if there's a country that's trying to take over everything, that is a very difficult thing to do, because then lots of other really powerful countries with other interests are going to turn against you. So how do you defeat the whole world by yourself? if you're going to do a world war, there are a lot of powerful actors right now. And it's one of those mutually assured destruction things where, I mean, yeah, maybe you could heck up your neighbor's base, but you're going to piss off a lot of people in the process. Good luck dealing with that. They will declare war on you. That's kind of what happened. What, after Pearl Harbor, a bunch of countries declared war on Japan, and was it based on a lot of Germany's actions in World War II, different countries declare war on them, so that's something that, if you're being the aggressor, you have to bear in mind is, sure, maybe you can take this engagement right now and beat up your neighbor, but are you going to be able to manage this in the long term in a sustainable way? I think the only example recently that comes to mind is Crimea, as like it was kind of a unofficial military operation where they had what were probably Russian military personnel who were there, and there was an exchange of power and this and that. There was some violence, but it wasn't of the scale of the world wars at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point. That's it's unlikely that a prospective World War III would involve or be initiated by an aggressive attempt to actually just seize territory such that you could, take over the world or some such. There's nuclear weapons make that prohibitively expensive, shall we say. Getting nuked is very expensive.
It also hurts.
Yeah. So conventional conflict is probably off the table in that sense. It probably will be more like, if you do want to expand, it'll probably be more something like salami tactics, using political subterfuge or influence or what have you. We've talked about salami tactics before. So something more like that. But the day of, rolling tank armies pouring over a border is probably over. Probably not likely to see that anymore. Large conventional armies are more a tool that you use against smaller neighboring states that are in your sphere of influence. They're not really something you use against other powers, because those other powers have nukes and you don't want to mess with that. Again, like I was kind of saying, I think the most likely possible, if there were a World War III, it's probably going to be because of a miscalculation. And that, Neuro's explanation is basically why. Because it would just be prohibitively expensive to actually just go out and say, oh yeah, let's have a nuclear war. Let's actually have World War III. I don't think anybody would have that as a starting point.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
It would most likely be an accident. Somebody thinks that if they do action A, that the other side will not respond and will not escalate, and then the other side does, and then there's an escalatory spiral that nobody intended but can't get out of. Kind of like World War I. World War I is probably the more relevant case study, since there was some inadvertent escalation there. I might add that after World War I, people thought that a World War II would be so destructive that nobody would ever actually dare start it. World War I was immensely destructive by the standards of the day. Basically everything east of Germany became a Mad Max movie after World War I. That's how bad it got. And even the rest of Europe was economically gutted. There was so much debt, there was so much government spending that nobody really was able to quite recover fully. It was very bad. And given how bad it was, everybody thought that World War II surely could never happen, because surely World War II would be even more destructive than World War I. So why even worry about it? And then it happened anyway. People were very disenchanted by that. There was kind of a sense of fatalism that emerged out of the Second World War that was even worse than the First World War. There was almost a sense that World War III was inevitable. That's something that a lot of people who did not grow up in the Cold War kind of take for granted. If you're under a certain age, you take for granted the fact that there probably won't be a massive humanity annihilating nuclear exchange at any given point in the day. It's possible. Everybody knows it's possible, but it's not likely, and you don't really let it bother you. It's not something you generally think about. In the Cold War, you definitely thought about it. Especially in the first 20-some years after World War II, everybody just kind of assumed it would happen. Like, yeah, we're thoroughly screwed. We couldn't stop the second one from happening. We're damn sure not stopping the third one from happening. It's gonna happen. So there's a lot of people who just kind of grew up with that tension. That was kind of the background noise of their lives. The fact that everything could just blow up one day, and you would have maybe 40 minutes notice. You know, you never knew. Obviously, more likely in times of tension, the Cuban Missile Crisis being a case in point. You know, if you live in anywhere, if you live anywhere, talk to your grandparents or your great-grandparents or whoever, if you have any, and ask them about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they'll be happy to tell you about how, oh yeah, we definitely thought we were all going to die. That was it. We were pretty confident it was coming, so everybody was very, very relieved when things were able to be de-escalated. So there was a sense that even in the it could happen even in the absence of a lead-up like the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a sense that there could be an accident somewhere, and then, boom, it just happens. There's a very good, well, maybe it wasn't very good, but there was a movie in the early 80s called, I want to say The Morning After? I'm blanking out a little bit. But basically, the entire movie was just basically about a nuclear exchange. And it started about a day or two before and then extended to a day after. And it wasn't like a really deep movie with a big plot. It was basically what would happen, what would it be like to live through that? And so I think you could probably see the scene on YouTube even. There's one scene where people at a baseball park actually see ICBMs taking off. And that was kind of the first time they realized what was happening. And so all through the Cold War, there was always the chance that that could happen to you. That you could just be kind of minding your own business, and then one day, oh shit. Missiles are that's probably bad. You would just hear the news on the radio, or maybe even have somebody tell it to you. Just, oh yeah, missiles were launched. World War III just broke out. You know, this is a tangent, but basically, if you grew up after the Cold War, count yourself lucky. You don't know how good you have it. That was a very real concern during the Cold War. But anyway, that's the answer to the World War III question. I don't think it'll happen soon. It could happen at some point. Who would start it? Who knows? It would probably be an accident between nuclear powers, and in that sense, it could be any of them.
Someone whose eyes are bigger than their stomach.
So to speak, yeah.
It would be great to rule the world, would it though? Would it though? Oh, we could totally do that. Could you though?
Yeah. I mean, if you don't mind the planet being microwaved, then yes. But maybe a microwave planet is not particularly worth having, especially if you get microwaved along with it. Let's see, any views on the recent observatory closures? I have none, because I did not know that there were any. I have not heard of this. Yeah, Googling it, none of this rings a bell, so... Sorry, I don't really have a comment on that, but thank you for bringing it up. That's something I could look into. Like I said, I'm not an expert in everything, and I damn sure don't hear about everything. So I certainly appreciate people giving me leads like that, but I'm sorry I don't have any comment on that. Let's see, what do you think about the crisis in Turkey? I wouldn't call it a crisis. It's not that bad. I mean, the economy is having some trouble, but most of that is just because Erdogan can't keep his fat mouth shut. He keeps making noise. Well, it's true, because most of the problem has to do with market confidence and the Turkey central bank raising interest rates to deal with inflation. There's a lot of inflation in Turkey. Well, not a lot, but there's growing inflation in Turkey, and it would be easy to deal with through conventional monetary policy. You just raise interest rates. Simple enough. But Erdogan has injected uncertainty in markets by saying that he doesn't think high interest rates will resolve the problem, and that he is opposed to high interest rates, and that he wants the central bank not to do it, not to raise interest rates in response to the inflation. And so that's created some concern in markets that maybe inflation will grow out of control in Turkey because the central bank may feel political pressure to not raise rates to try to tamp down on inflation. But I think last week the central bank did raise rates by a pretty significant margin, and I think that kind of alleviated some of the pressure in markets. You know, and I think Erdogan immediately introduced some again by whining about it. But if he would just shut the hell up for like a month, the problem would probably resolve itself. You know, the issue in Turkey is with the Turkish economy has more to do with, for one, fiscal stimulus. There's a lot of government spending on infrastructure and infrastructure projects and whatnot. That would be easy to cut back. That's well within the power of the AKP to do that. Maybe it's not politically feasible because the AKP patronage network requires such infrastructure projects, but I would think Erdogan would have enough power centralized in his office by this point to not need those patronage networks as much. So I would think that would be pretty easy to deal with. And, there's US sanctions, but I don't really think that's been a big dent on the economy. It'll dent it a little bit, but most of Turkey's economy is more dependent on trade with Europe. And the Europeans don't have any sanctions and aren't going to put any sanctions on Turkey anytime soon. So in that sense, they should be fine. Yeah, I mean, the principal problem, I think, is just market confidence from the inflation issue, and that's easy enough to deal with. I don't think there's any reason, there's nothing in the economic fundamentals of the Turkish economy that suggests that Turkey's economic downturn should be anything but cyclical. There will be a downturn, just from the inflation and the higher rates, and just from general overindulgence. Whenever there's an economic boom, people invest in things they shouldn't invest in. The investments go bust, and then there's a downturn, and there's a correction, and then the economy picks up again, maybe a year or two later. I imagine Turkey is kind of on that path. And I think even Erdogan himself and the AKP government have talked about how the upcoming recession, because there's going to be an economic downturn just because there's so much inflation and high interest rates and whatnot. They've talked about how the upcoming downturn could help deal with the inflation. Because of course, recessions and downturns are deflationary generally. So maybe over the course of the next year, there will be a dip in the Turkish economy, and then it'll pick back up, assuming that inflation does not grow out of control because the central bank is not dealing with it appropriately. But beyond that, I don't see any reason for the Turkish economy to just tank. There isn't any I don't think there's enough evidence of that to suggest that's going to happen, which is why I'm skeptical that you can really call it a crisis. It's really more of at this point, it's not a crisis, I would argue. It could be, but at this point, I would argue it's just more of a problem, a policy challenge, if you will. We'll see. I still think that I would argue that Erdogan is just trying to appease his base to try to control the political damage that the economic downturn is going to cause. He probably is afraid that the AKP is going to lose support because of the economic downturn that's kind of coming. And he wants to make it seem like he's opposed to the austerity measures and high interest rates that are needed to kind of deal with circumstances so that the AKP does not take as much of a political hit. But otherwise will allow the AKP and the central bank to take what measures are necessary to deal with the problems. Basically good cop, bad cop. Erdogan complains and tries to maintain political support by making it seem like he's a victim, while at the same time allowing other institutions to do their part in dealing with the economic downturn as normal. Political theater, if you will. That would be my bet. That's my suspicion at this point about what's happening in Turkey. Investors don't like it because it's creating uncertainty, but I think ultimately where the rubber hits the road, the Turkish economy will probably be fine. And then by extension, the AKP. Now, I assume when you refer to the crisis that you're referring to the economy, I guess you could also be referring to just Turkey's international position. Certainly Turkey's position in Syria is coming under pressure, and the country is getting more and more isolated from the West. But I would not argue that that's a crisis either. We've talked a bit about this before, but I don't think Turkey is isolating itself from the West or engaging with Russia. I think what it's doing is becoming more independent. I think it wants to pursue a more independent foreign policy in which it's less dependent on established alliances. So they're diversifying their relationships a little bit. But being in NATO and having economic ties to Europe, I would argue, is too valuable to really break with the West completely. So probably he's going to do as much as he can to try to appease his base by looking strong and independent, and catering some of Russia's policy preferences to build some relationship there. But fundamentally, he's going to maintain those economic and military ties to the West because those are just innately valuable. You know, some of what he wants to do is kind of exemplified in the Syria adventure. I would still maintain that Erdogan and the AKP government in Turkey probably intervened in Syria early in the conflict, believing that it would be over soon, that Bashar al-Assad would be overthrown within a year or two, and that it would be an easy pickup for Turkey's burgeoning sphere of influence. And Turkey had been building a sphere of influence before that by engaging with the Middle East, building economic ties, cultural ties, what have you. So it seems like one of the things Erdogan wanted to do was to try to make Turkey an independent, strong regional actor, independent of the West. And the Syria adventure obviously put a crimp in that. You know, that did not quite work out the way that they probably were planning. But I don't think it's going to really be a big setback for them. Turkey has enough military power and economic influence, for that matter, to hold on to Idlib province if it really wants to. And I don't think Russia really cares enough about Damascus to really pitch in and try to push the Turks out. You know, certainly Russia would prefer to have a friendlier relationship with Turkey. Turkey would be the bigger ally than Syria ever was. You know, Syria at this point is a broken, what would you call it? Not a non-state actor, but well, it's a broken state. It doesn't have a lot to offer as an ally beyond territory. But Turkey, on the other hand, is a large economy, has a large military, has a lot of influence in the region. So if Russia has to choose between having decent relations between Syria and Turkey, it would probably lean towards Turkey. It won't abandon Syria because it has a military base there, it has investments there, etc. It has a lot of diplomatic capital invested in Syria at this point. But it would probably prefer to have friendlier relations with Turkey just because that would open up a lot of possibilities in terms of military contracts, in terms of economic cooperation. You know, there's been a lot of talk about the gas pipeline through Turkey and Turkey buying the S-300 missile defense system from Russia. You know, that's created a lot of diplomatic waves. There's a lot more of that kind of thing that Russia could do with Turkey if relations are good. So Russia will probably not antagonize the Turks too much in areas of disagreement. But Turkey itself, I don't think, is seeking out an alliance with Russia because, for one, they're at odds in Syria. They're on different sides. And also because Turkey, again, wants to be more independent. It doesn't want to be dependent. And engaging with Russia does not necessarily mean that they're going to become more dependent. But given how much gas that Turkey imports from Russia, getting tighter, for example, taking discounts on gas from Russia would open Turkey up to Russian influence. Discounted gas is one of the ways that the Russian government exerts influence in the Balkans. So I don't know that the Turkish government is interested in kind of exposing itself more to that vector.
To take a step back 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire is something that I think a lot of us forget about when we're considering that general region and how much of a world leader that was. It's a big factor in the Viking Age of War book that I'm reading right now. They had like the latest tech and everything back in that period.
Yeah.
And it's the land bridge area between Asia and Europe. So it's a really key area to control, and it also means that the cultural and military spread is going to be very mixed compared to other places that are more isolated of either just clearly Asia or clearly Europe. Mikkelgard is what the Vikings called it.
Mikkelgard.
Yeah. There were quite a few mercenaries who worked for the Empire there. Apparently it paid really well. Pretty simple work. Go over here, kill this shit. Okay. Now you're speaking my language.
I have to read up on that.
Yeah, it was one of those things where their typical order of operations is, can we raid, pillage, and just take everything? And they get to the Byzantine Empire and they just get smashed, and it's like, okay, this is a different animal. We'll work for you. How's that sound?
Yeah. Yeah, if you're gonna have mercenaries in the medieval era, you could do a lot worse than Vikings. Sometimes you don't even need to pay them to attack your enemies.
There's an Amon Amarth song about it too, if people want some.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Their stuff is very... It's kind of history and also the sagas and fiction themed. It's pretty blurry between like what is historical fact and what is drummed up a little bit for flair. But they have a song about the mercenaries that were operating in the Byzantine Empire, Middle East and stuff.
Wow. Music has changed a lot over the past few decades.
Yeah. Some people are talking about Sabaton. Have you heard of that band?
I don't know anything about bands anymore.
Okay, well Sabaton is like a hard rock / metal-ish band, and there was a viewer who was in my stream who was saying, yeah, I'm not really into rock and metal, but Sabaton's lyrics are about history. Like they'll make a rock song about a battle in World War II or something, and they like hearing about the battles and stuff, so they listen to this band. Not because they would go for that genre just on its own, but because it's history based.
Mm-hmm. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, just to put a bow on that Turkey question, when you're kind of interpreting signals, be they diplomatic or political, from Turkey, keep in mind that fundamentally Erdogan is a basically neo-Ottoman nationalist, and that his style of politics is very opportunistic and self-serving. So just because he escalates tensions with your country or is more friendly to your country or whatever, that's not really a significant sign in and of itself. That just means he perceives a potential opportunity for him and his party in your country, or with your party, or with whatever. It's, you know, people like Erdogan being opportunistic generally are not that interested in long-term relationships predicated on, you know, common philosophies or, you know, the big picture type stuff. Let's have an alliance predicated on liberal democracy or communism or whatever. You know, the strongman authoritarian leader is in it for himself, and all politics is contractual in that sense for them. So alliances made today could very easily be gone tomorrow. That's Turkey. Okay, so that's hopefully that was a satisfactory answer to the Turkey question. If I didn't quite get at the crux of what this person was asking about, you know, I encourage them to let me know, and can kind of dig into that, whatever aspect they want to get into more specifically.
You're so nice. I really look forward to the April Fool's episode. If anyone has any further... The April Fool's episode that we do. If anyone has any further questions, well, too bad. Just the usual disclaimer, I'm an expert in everything, so if I say something, that means that it's necessarily true in all cases. And if you disagree, then you're wrong. Wow! The Dark Agent Smith.
Oh man, how much do you want to bet that if we did that, that video would get more views than any of the ones we've ever done?
Yeah, welcome to the age of memes. Will you be surprised by that? Standard.
Standard.
Yeah, we've talked about my sneeze video, where I'll like put 10 hours of effort into some class where I'm trying to teach the StarCraft people something complex and technical about the game to help them improve, and then I sneeze and fall out of my chair and I get like triple the views.
Oh, internet. Never change. Let's see, so... Does a space force violate treaties on the militarization of space? It depends on how you do it. The way that the Trump administration has been talking about it suggests that the answer would be no. Because what they've been talking about is not so much the creation of a space military, like, you know, spaceships and space warship. What they've been talking about is more taking the elements of existing departments, well, not departments, but existing branches like the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, especially Air Force, taking the elements of those branches that relate to space, pulling them out of their branches that they're in now, and merging them into a new branch that would be called Space Force or something. I can't imagine them actually calling it Space Force when all is said and done if they actually do this, but for lack of a better term, for now, Space Force. So that's more the crux of it. It's not so much a new branch of the military, so much as it is a reorganization of branches, a reorganization of departments within the Department of Defense. That's kind of more the crux of it. And as far as I know, that's well within the legal bounds of treaties on the militarization of space. So if that is the way that they go, if that is how they implement it, then no, it would be perfectly legal. Let's see. What do you think the economic impact of the tariffs on steel and aluminum will have on the consumer level? I work in an industry that uses a lot of steel and aluminum in our manufacturing, and our costs have gone up well over 200% in the 8 months for what's unfortunately an inferior product to what is produced in India, the UAW, and China. If it were not for our government contracts, we'd be in trouble, as our citizen consumer pool has dropped to almost nothing due to the price increases we've had to pass on to them. It's a pretty interesting perspective. Like I was saying earlier, the first-person perspectives are always the best and most informative. So, all right, let me think about this. What do I think about the well, I mean, I think you kind of laid it out for us. I mean, the economic impact of the tariffs was always going to be that steel products became more expensive as a result of more expensive inputs. That could change in the medium to long term if the U.S. steel industry takes the extra profits that it's getting from tariff protection and invests in productive capacity. If they invest in the business and hire more people and produce more, then eventually a new equilibrium will be reached in which more steel is being produced and prices come back down. They probably still won't be as low as they were before the tariffs, but over the long term, hypothetically, more investment in the industry will lead to lower prices. Now, on the other hand, they might not do that at all. They might take the proceeds from tariff protection and use that just as extra profits, stock buybacks, financial stuff like that. And they could do that if they expect the tariffs to go away at some point. It may be that there's not enough confidence in the long-term viability of the tariffs to justify investment in the base industry, in which case there's not really much to be gained from over the long term from the tariffs. If the tariffs are meant to protect the U.S. steel industry and they just go away at some point, then eventually you're just back to square one. I don't know enough about the steel industry to know whether or not the U.S. could actually prop up a steel industry solely with government contracts, and maybe this person would know better than I would. But if you could do that, then the tariffs aren't really accomplishing anything. Again, the tariffs would have to be in place over a very long period to justify investment such that the industry could expand. And it seems pretty unlikely. I don't think anybody expects that, because there's still a lot of people in the political and economic sphere, both inside and outside the United States, who think that Trump's protectionist policies are probably a blip on the radar, who think that they're probably going to leave with Trump once he leaves office, either after his first term or his second term. So there's a lot of skepticism that protectionism has legs as a policy in the United States, and that being the case, there's not enough confidence to justify that investment. So probably, if that's true, if that characterization is accurate, the steel industry will not invest and steel prices will stay high until the tariffs are reduced or removed entirely. And given that that probably won't happen until after Trump leaves office, you can probably expect high steel prices until at least 2020. Or, yeah, 2020, that's when the next presidential election is. Possibly 2024. Maybe even longer if protectionism actually does prove to have legs. I could be wrong, and maybe protectionism is here to stay in some form or another. But probably the earliest you could hope for is 2020, I would expect. But yeah, I guess I'm getting off the question. The question was, what do I think the economic impact of the tariffs on steel and aluminum will be on the consumer level? I mean, just basic economics is that prices will go up. Because, I mean, the only way prices don't go up is if producers of goods that use steel as an input absorb the higher costs of steel into their profit margin. So basically, they take less profits. I don't know how many industries have big profit margins with which to absorb higher steel prices. I know I've read that a lot of them have, but I imagine there's also a lot that invariably don't. So I would expect over the long term, consumer prices to go up. I mean, even if you're an industry that can absorb those extra costs, lower profits means that your business is, well, obviously less profitable, but the implication of a less profitable business is, one, you get less investment, because investment dollars could be used elsewhere. You know, if you have to choose between a more profitable industry and a less profitable industry for investment, you choose the more profitable industry. If an industry becomes less profitable, that invariably results in a redistribution of investment dollars away from that industry into other more profitable industries. So it makes it harder to get money, it makes the business less attractive, it makes investing in the business less attractive, just even if you're the owner. You know, you don't want to expand a business that's not really as profitable. Maybe if you think, you know, depending on the structure of the business, if you think you can get more revenue by expanding, then you could do it. But that gets into the nitty-gritty details of, you know, the microeconomics of the business, you know, variable costs versus fixed costs, that kind of thing. But just in general, the literature on trade suggests that if you cut off trade or use tariffs or what have you, inputs are going to be more expensive. And just from those more expensive inputs, industries either have to take less profits or raise the prices. I mean, that pressure has to go somewhere. And over the long term, it may be that businesses that have to absorb that into profits eventually have no choice but to parlay them into prices in order to kind of get back some of the profits they've been getting to try to justify more investment in the industry, or in the firm, as it were. That could, I guess it depends also on whether, because this person doesn't really specify if they're in an exporting industry or an importing industry. I think they mentioned what has gone up well over what's produced in India, the UAW, and the So I guess this, I guess I can't really infer. Well, if you're in an import competing industry, it's problematic. Well, I guess either way, actually. Because if you're dealing with imports, then people who produce your good could import that good produced with cheaper steel bought from China or whoever, in which case you're at a cost disadvantage. If you're an exporter, then obviously you're having to produce steel that's more expensive than the steel bought by your competitors. So if you're producing a good that uses steel as an input, then whether you're an exporter or an importer, you're losing out. You're less competitive relative to your peers. The math works out a little differently if you're an actual steel producer. Given that the United States is more of a steel importer, though, that's not great to make that import more expensive. On the net, you're just hurting yourself by doing that. I don't want to start chasing my tail. I haven't read the literature on, if there is any, on steel and trade specifically. And if I were going to comment specifically on what the impact of steel tariffs would be on the broader economy and specific industries and sectors, I would have to read that literature. Which is why I'm speaking in generalities. You know, in general, prices go up, et cetera, et cetera. That's the broad international trade literature, which I'm more familiar with. But I'm sure there's been sector studies on the steel industry in particular that you could probably look into to give you a better idea of what the implications will be in the medium to long term of steel tariffs. And without having read those, I don't want to commit too much on what the likely impact will be. Every industry and firm is unique. Every sector has its own little eccentricities. And understanding those is important to the calculation and estimation of how given industries and sectors respond to trade wars or taxes or any kind of public policy question. So I'm sorry that I might not be able to give you the question answer in as much detail as you would like in that sense. But just broadly, I would expect prices to go up or profits to be eaten into one way or the other. That would be the principal takeaway. trying to think of some second-order considerations. When you do a cost-benefit analysis, you start with the obvious. You know, what is the direct effect of policy X on whatever it's meant to target? You know, maybe it's the Obama administration had a little scheme for a while where they offered people a rebate to buy new cars, I think. The idea was to replace older, more polluting cars and to replace them with newer, less polluting cars. So the government, it was also meant as a kind of stimulus program to deal with the fallout from the Great Recession, the '08 financial crisis. So if you were to do a cost-benefit analysis of that, you would try to look at what the impact was on the automotive industry. You know, how successful, what was the impact on the automotive market, what was the impact on consumers, blah, 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 etc. But after you do that, then you look at secondary effects. And secondary effects refer to the effects that are felt in other areas of the economy. The policy was meant to impact the automotive industry, in so much as it was a stimulative policy meant to generate sales. But it would have invariably had secondary effects on other sectors of the economy related to the automotive industry. So secondary effects are an important aspect of trying to understand what the fallout from a given policy's implementation is. So I'm trying to think of what some secondary effects to the steel industry steel tariff implementation was. And I mean, again, this guy actually has a lot of the fallout in his question. That's the clear example of the fallout. As for secondary effects, just beyond producers having a harder time getting cheaper inputs rather. You could look at employment, because I think employment in steel producing communities with a steel producing industry or firm have ticked up. There has been some more investment, some additional investment in steel producing firms. So in that sense, there's more employment, jobs, demand, etc. in those places. But I would have to look at the numbers to see what the impact has been in steel consuming industries. I've read just colloquially, informally, I've read that they've been getting hit, but I don't know how hard they're getting hit. You know, how much investment has been diverted, how many jobs have been laid off, etc. You know, without knowing the specific numbers, I'm hesitant to commit on that. But that's what you would have to look at to see the secondary effect. You know, the immediate effect was help the steel industry. Secondary effect is steel consuming industry. And I'm sure there's bound to be a lot of tertiary effects. I can't even begin to imagine what those would be. Again, I'd have to read the literature. Let's see. Do you think Trump's steel and proposed car tariffs might not only target European economies, but also Russia, because it largely supplies Germany and other countries with raw metal? Do you think Trump's steel and proposed car tariffs might not only... As far as well, the car tariffs and the steel tariffs are very different things. The steel tariff thing was almost political theater, because there's long been a feeling amongst, especially the Midwest of the U.S., traditional steel-producing regions of the U.S., that foreign competitors are cheating, basically, that the competition with foreign competitors is unfair, and that previous governments had not gone to bat to protect them from that foreign competition because they were afraid of China or because of, you know, lack of political will, let's say. Really wanted to throw a bone to those people because they were a big part of why he won the presidency. That was kind of red meat. You know, part of the reason he won is because he promised to actually deliver on some of those protections for those industries. The actual economic argument for protecting the steel industry is a little bit weak. It's true that there's definitely been some degree of dumping from China, so in that sense, there should be higher tariffs, but there were already higher tariffs meant to deal with that. You know, jacking up tariffs additionally to try to create a thriving, healthy steel industry in the U.S. is probably a non-starter. Again, to justify that, you would have to have the tariffs in place a long time, and the markets would have to have confidence that tariffs would be in place a long time to invest in the steel industry such that it could become large and healthy again like it used to be. And yeah, I keep saying healthy, but it's actually already healthy. What happened with the steel industry is that it automated. There was a lot of technology that displaced jobs, and it specialized. It moved away from general steel production and started specializing in niche specialized steel products. So those are higher priced, high value premium steel products, but they don't require as much employees because one, automation, two, the industry itself just doesn't need to be as large. So roughly that's what I remember reading about the steel industry's evolution. So it actually is kind of healthy as it is. It's just not nearly as big as it used to be in the communities that it's traditionally been the primary economic driver. No amount of tariffs is going to kind of bring that back. Those jobs are, there will be some investment in response to the tariffs, but that's probably going to be fleeting. Again, I don't expect those tariffs to be long-term. And more to the point, the effect of the tariffs is going to mitigate any gain. Yes, you can charge higher prices for your steel, but the people who buy your steel are not going to buy as much because the prices are higher. So again, without that long-term investment to increase production, to invest in economies of scale, you're not going to get those lower prices such that you can be sustainably large, such that you can sustainably compete with those cheaper foreign producers. Again, you don't really need to. The steel industry is already relatively profitable. It just doesn't produce the same goods it used to, and it's not as profitable as it used to be. But tariffs are not really going to deal with that problem. I can feel myself starting to chase my tail on that, so I apologize if that sounds confusing. Again, haven't read that literature, so I'm trying to make as much sense as I can, given what I remember. But steel tariffs are that. That's a rough outline of what's happening with steel. The proposed car tariffs are a tool that the Trump administration is using to try to pressure the European Union into a free trade deal in which there are no tariffs, basically. And it's true that the European Union produces steel and that the steel tariffs partly target them, but given that the United States has not really given much ground on that, the only countries that have been given exemptions are countries that have accepted voluntary export quotas of steel. So it seems like this is kind of an important political marker for the Trump administration that they're not going to give up easily. The car tariff thing, on the other hand, is something that you can only really use with countries that export a lot of cars to the United States. That's South Korea, Japan, the EU. And those countries have a lot more ability to resist pressure from the United States in terms of trade agreements, especially the EU, which is a very large market in its own right. And in fact, it's a larger market than the United States. So the car tariffs are meant more to try to leverage them, specifically Germany within the European Union, which exports a lot of cars to the United States. But I think that principal objective is more meant as leverage than a ends unto itself. With regard to whether the target not only Europe but also Russia, I don't think so. Because Russia doesn't export hardly any steel to the United States, as far as I know. And the only effect of, it wouldn't really impact German-Russian steel trade at all, I wouldn't think. Not off the top of my head. Because if you can't sell as much steel to the United States, in so much as Russia was selling any, that just means that your steel has to be sold more cheaply in other places. So the price of steel outside the United States actually goes down while it's going up in the United States as a result of the tariffs. And so cheaper steel for Germany just helps them. That just makes them even more competitive relative to American car producers. So I don't think, if the tariffs were meant to target Russia to try to make German less competitive, then the effect would be opposite. So I don't think that was the intended effect. I really think the steel tariff is more just a political thing for the Trump administration. Try to help out the Midwest, or at least make the Midwest think that it's looking out for them. And the car tariffs, in turn, I think are a separate issue that has to do with trade negotiations with the European Union. Let's see. What was the real impact of the US and the European theater on the outcome of World War II? I've heard everything from they single-handedly saved Europe to they had no effect and they were just fighting a beaten enemy. I remind everyone, as a preface to this answer, I'm not an expert. So please be merciful. I'm not an expert on World War II. I've read about it, so I'm familiar with it, especially in high school.
Can I give a quick joke answer to this first before you give the real answer?
By all means.
So there's an ancient, I think it's a Chinese proverb that a single grain of rice can tip the scale. The US in World War II was like a giant cheeseburger that tipped the scale, where it wasn't everything that was on the scale, but it was more than a grain of rice. And you could measure how much it was, but it would be difficult to measure, so it's just better to use a lazy analogy. Okay, you can give the real answer now.
Well, what was the real impact of the United States in the European theater on the outcome of World War II? See, these are tricky questions because it's a little bit ambiguous. The phrase real impact can be interpreted very narrowly or very broadly. So in terms of the direct military impact of the U.S. Army and Navy, and as it was known then, the U.S. Army Air Force on the Western Front was pretty substantial, in so much as the United States military was the dominant military force on the Western Front. That's not to say that the British military and the Canadian military and the sundry other contributing nations, other nationalities involved, did not have substantive contributions to make.
Australia.
Well, I don't think Australia so much was in Western Europe at that time.
Damn.
Although that is an interesting question, what they were doing at the time. Nobody really talks about Australia in the Pacific Theater. In fact, the Pacific Theater doesn't get talked about a lot in general when it comes to World War II. People like to focus on Europe. Well, that's a tangent. If somebody wants to talk about Australia in the Pacific Theater, we can. There's some interesting material there. But in Western Europe, the United States was very important just by dint of its size. It easily comprised the largest single military force on the Western Front. And after D-Day, it was U.S. military, U.S. armored forces under General Patton that broke out from Normandy into France and encircled German forces in the Falaise pocket, I think it was, and then pressed inward and met forces moving north from Operation Dragoon. I don't know how many people know about Operation Dragoon, for that matter. Everybody knows about Operation Overlord, which was the Allied landing on Normandy. Lesser known is that not long after the landings on Normandy, there was actually another set of landings in southern France called Operation Dragoon. It was comprised of forces taken from Italy and North Africa, if I remember correctly.
It's really fun that both of these are named after StarCraft units.
I hadn't thought of it, but fair point. I suppose they are. Perhaps Blizzard took some inspiration.
Or perhaps the war took inspiration from the game.
Well, who's to say? Who's to say? Maybe there was some time travel involved.
Sure.
There's a lot of alternate history fiction out there.
You can't disprove it.
Technically true. Technically true. But the U.S. military, by dint of size, was... right. Operation Dragoon was in the south. So General Patton and his armored forces moved south from the breakout and kind of met up with those Operation Dragoon forces moving from the south and linked up, pushed east. So in that sense, the U.S. military was very important. Later on, well, okay, in that sense it was very important, but what about a different sense? In terms of the overarching war, not just the Western Front, but the broader European theater, how important was the United States? Yeah, that's kind of the big debate, isn't it? It's hard to judge, because by that point, the Red Army was doing pretty well for itself. This would have been, Operation Overlord was 1944, and it was timed to coincide with offensives in Italy and the Eastern Front. Nobody remembers the Italian offensive because it's Italy, and it was kind of a secondary front by that point. But on the Eastern Front, there was what was called Operation Bagration. And I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Maybe if there's some Russians listening, they can correct me on that. But Operation Bagration was roughly coincided with Overlord. And it was a massive offensive that crushed Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. It just ate up huge numbers of German troops and resources. And from that point on, the Soviets were basically continuously on the offensive somewhere on the Eastern Front. That was kind of the starting bang, the starting gun rather, to a basically endless series of Red Army offensives over there. And it's not really clear if the Germans ever had a chance of stopping the Red Army at that point. So you could argue that even if the United States had not landed in conjunction with the British and France and opened the Western Front, that maybe the Red Army could have just crushed the Germans anyway. I don't know how accurate that is, though, because even if the Western Front did not have the best that the German army had, that was still 40-some divisions that the Red Army didn't have to face. That's not to say if they did have to face them, they wouldn't have been able to deal with them, but it would have been a lot harder, for sure. And maybe, outside chance, the Germans could have fought to a stalemate. Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those difficult hypothetical questions that's kind of impossible to answer. What if the Western Front hadn't been opened? In that sense, maybe. Maybe the United States was not as important in its contribution to the European theater. So then, we've gone from the Western Front to the European theater. So what about the context of the war overall? So beyond direct military contribution, what about the strategic contribution of the United States? That's a little bit different, and you can make a much stronger argument for the United States in that case. So Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union is kind of overblown here in the United States. You know, people kind of make it out as though the Soviets were completely dependent on Lend-Lease, and you know, if it weren't for Lend-Lease equipment and supplies, that they wouldn't have been able to fight at all. You know, that's not true. Lend-Lease didn't really take off until, at least Lend-Lease to the Soviets, didn't really start arriving in any substantive quantity until 1943, I think it was. 41 was too early. There was just nothing going on then. And in 42, they started up, but a lot of the ships were intercepted by the Germans. It was basically too dangerous, and the routes they had to use, which were safer, were so long that it took an inordinate period of time to get the supplies there. You know, basically the Norway route, the way around northern Scandinavia to Murmansk, was too dangerous. In fact, I think I remember reading about Task Force 18. It was a large task force carrying supplies to the Soviet Union, was almost obliterated by, I think it was the Bismarck, which at that time was still out there. Basically, some German pocket battleships and German air power just gutted them. And after that, there was a great reluctance to send shipping through that route. So most Lend-Lease from that point went through Persia, basically all the way down the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, up to Persia, across Persia, into the Soviet Union, or across the Pacific into the Russian Far East, and then across the Russian Trans-Siberian Railway. That's a pretty long logistical tale, to put it mildly. So a lot of Lend-Lease did not really arrive in great quantity until 1943. And so that first 2 years kind of shows that the Red Army was able to kind of hold its own to a degree. It's not to say that no Lend-Lease got there in 42 or that it didn't matter, but the major Lend-Lease supplies didn't really get there until later. But the reason I bring the real reason I bring this up is that to point out that there were some things that the Red Army really, really appreciated in the Lend-Lease program. And it's debatable that they could have gone on without those things. And I'll elaborate on that because Russians have to put up with Western arrogance about Lend-Lease a lot. So I want to throw them a bone here. Basically, one of the things that the Red Army got from Lend-Lease that they appreciated the most was trucks. It wasn't actually so much the weapons and ammunition and airplanes and that kind of thing. It was actually trucks. And the reason that the trucks were really useful is because it allowed the Red Army to have a more extended logistical tail. You can tell I don't have a background in the military, so this might sound jarbled, but I'm going to make an effort here. Basically, if you want to launch an offensive and sustain it, you need to have a logistical train that can keep up with you, that can keep up with your frontline units. Having trucks allows you to do that to a much greater extent, because otherwise you're dealing with horse and carriage stuff, or you have to stay close to rail lines. And sometimes that's just not enough. Sometimes the rail lines are not available. Sometimes the horse and carriage supplies can't keep up with your faster, most mobile units. If you have trucks, then you can carry all your supplies on those trucks and they can keep up with your offensive. And they can keep it going. Like if you penetrate the front line with an armored division, you don't have to stop a week later. You don't have to stop with the penetration 100, maybe 10, 20, 100 kilometers in. You can refuel your units with the supplies from your trucks and keep the penetration going. So the Red Army suffered a lot from a lack of that logistical capacity early in the war, 41, 42. And in 43 and 44, when you start seeing sustained Red Army offensives, a lot of that is, well, maybe not a lot of it, but a big part of that, the reason that they were able to start doing that is because they had those trucks available to enhance their logistical tail, the logistical capacity. Now, there's also some other things they appreciated from Lend-Lease, like communications equipment, radios, raw resources. It might seem strange to hear that they appreciated raw resources, but it's true that the Soviets produced most of the raw resources they needed, but they didn't have the expertise or equipment to produce everything they needed. It's all good and well if you can produce steel, but then you also have to refine it, and then you also have to manipulate it into the shape that you need it in. And Soviet industry was not in the best shape after the Western territories had been conquered in 41. A lot of heavy industry was in the Ukraine, Western Russia, South, the Donbass region, to a lesser degree Belarus. So losing that territory kind of really hurt heavy industry. They were able to relocate a lot of it, but not all of it. So they weren't able to produce everything they need. So they were able to get things like telephone wire, rail lines, trains, a lot of stuff like that that was that they could produce on their own, but that they couldn't quite produce enough of on their own. The extra capacity was very much appreciated and improved their logistical capacity significantly, as well as their command and control capacity. But the trucks were the big one. That's the one that kind of pops up the most. So you could argue then that the Red Army could not have beaten the Germans in World War II without that improvement in their logistical capacity from Lend-Lease. I've read it postulated that maybe they could have fought to a standstill, but maybe not victory outright. That they wouldn't have had the mobility necessary to really defeat the Wehrmacht. So, in that sense, the United States had a very important contribution to make in the European theater, strategically speaking, in so much as it empowered the Red Army to reach its full potential as a war-fighting institution, and enabled it to really not only check the German advance in Eastern Europe, but to reverse it and roll it back. Also, the United States kind of did something similar with the British. The British Army got gutted pretty good after Dunkirk, well, because of Dunkirk. And so Lend-Lease played a big part in helping them rebuild that army and allowing it to reach a capacity such that it could participate in the invasion of Europe. So the US also contributed in that sense. Now, I haven't even touched yet on the bombing campaign, which was the principal US and Western contribution before D-Day. That was not great. I mean, the US Army Air Force, or the US Air Force as it was called later after the war, did a big study after the war trying to evaluate how effective the bombing campaign had been during the war. And what they found was not encouraging. What they found is that the bombing campaign in 1942 and 1943 was not terribly impactful. And the reason for that is that they were targeting industries producing finished goods that were able to recover very quickly from attacks. And the Germans themselves had been very good about fortifying their factories and, putting them underground, doing whatever they had to. So the industrial disruption was not significant in 42, 43. So in that sense, the US contribution to the European theater, I'm gonna get some water real quick. In that sense, the U.S. contribution was not that great early early in its involvement in the European Union. But in 1944 and 45, the bombing campaign became much more effective. For one, German air power had begun to be watered down by the introduction of the P-51 Mustang, which had the range to escort bombers all the way into Europe, all the way throughout a mission, and were able to defend against German fighters. That really ate into the Luftwaffe considerably. So that reduced losses and allowed the bombing command to up the tempo, basically. Because losses had been catastrophic in 42, 43. Losses were very high. You know, they basically had to stop the bombing campaign in 43 because the losses were just not sustainable. It was really brutal to be an airman during that period. But later on, German air defenses had been softened up a bit, and they started having more of an impact, in part also because they started changing their targets. They started targeting intermediate industries. So rather than targeting the tank factory or the aircraft factory, they started targeting things like ball bearings factory. Right. So ball bearings are an input you need to produce tanks, aircraft, whatever. If you don't have them, then you can't produce as many, or any at all. And those factories were not as resilient to bombing. And as a result, that set of targets that they hit was much more impactful in disrupting German industry. And German industry was considerably regressed as a result. They were still able to produce quite a bit. In fact, Germany was able to produce shockingly high amounts of materials, even very late in the war. Impressively so, but the bombing campaign was significantly more effective later in the war than earlier. So in that sense, the U.S. had a significant strategic impact in curtailing the material power of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. So that's, I mean, really you could go all day about it. I mean, what was the real impact of the U.S. in the European theater? I mean, I'm sure that people have counter-arguments and arguments, and it's just one of those hypothetical things that you could kind of go all day about. It would be fun to do so, but this is my contribution, I guess. This is what I can conjure up. Short answer to the question, maybe. Not the most satisfying answer, but it's hard to come to a conclusive answer to a question that is that hypothetical. How are we doing on time?
Well, we've gone for more than, I think, 3 hours. It's kind of up to you. I think because the viewership is so high, we got a crap ton of questions. So we don't need to go through everything. I can tell your voice is getting a little bit tired.
Oh, you can hear that, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Water not quite doing its job there.
No need to apologize for your humanity. Unless you want to.
Well, that would be the Christian thing to do, wouldn't it?
Yep.
Human weakness is verboten. To be fair to Christians, that's not only a Christian thing, that's an ascetic thing. There's lots of philosophies that embrace asceticism in that vein. I'm not entirely averse to it myself. But let's see, I'll try to go a little bit longer to kind of butt into some more of the questions here. At least until my voice, unless my voice gives out. When will we face the next big recession? And if I knew that, I could make so much goddamn money. I could short all the right stocks.
That's a $1 trillion question.
Yeah. When will we face the next big recession? I don't know. I mean, it's impossible to tell. There will probably be at least a minor recession in the next couple years. You know, the business cycle, and just because of the business cycle, basically, I would expect a downturn along with some other short-term minor exogenous shocks. But I don't know specifically when the next big recession would be or what would cause it. You know, I think we actually had somebody ask that question basically last week, and I had to give a kind of similar answer, but I think I had more substance to add as far as what it might look like and what it, you know, what could trigger it, etc. so I might reference that. I can't remember the answer off the top of my head. But basically, it may or may not be financial. It could be inflation. It could be driven by inflation, which might be shocking given the mysterious absence of inflation thus far, but who's to say? It could finally make its dramatic reappearance. It could come from some policy mishap. I mean, there's any number of things that could happen. But it's just hard to judge what'll happen in the future. Excuse me. What's your evaluation of Germany's current foreign policy? Germany has a foreign policy? That's my answer. Who knew? Germany has a foreign policy. Really, Germany has been very passive over the past few decades. Their foreign policy is basically to just sit tight and try to create forums in which international issues can be worked out multilaterally. That's been more the gist of Germany's traditional foreign policy. It was a bit of a departure then for Angela Merkel to kind of throw open Germany's borders the way she did in 2014. That was kind of a bold move. That was very much a sovereign German decision rather than a multilateral consensus type decision that Germany's kind of more known for. And as we saw, that did not work out terribly well for Angela Merkel or for Germany. So they've kind of returned more to their multilateral origins, their more multilateral status quo. That seems to be more Germany's preference. But that's a rough read of it. If you're asking what their policy is on specific issues like Turkey or Russia, then I would say their stance is defensive, basically. You know, on something like Turkey, they don't want to damage economic ties, because there are a lot of strong economic ties there, but they don't want to open the door to further deepening of economic ties, given concerns about Erdogan's politics, as well as just instability in the region. You know, the PKK, the Turkish military, etc. So there's some reticence there on that account. They've dealt with the Turks in so much as they felt they've had to in order to deal with the migration crisis. That's been the principal point of contact diplomatically between Germany and Turkey. Yeah, it's really going now. On something like Russia, they're concerned about Russian interference, and they're especially concerned about the seizure of territory in the Crimea, because that kind of upsets the status quo in Europe, which is very much not only in everyone in Europe's benefit, but very much to Germany in particular's benefit. So their attitude there has been to try to create a consensus that sanctions should be upheld. You know, the principal point of contact there is with regard to sanctions on Russia. Germany doesn't seem to have a lot of appetite for military engagement with Ukraine or military aid to the Ukraine. So they seem more focused on the economic pressure on Russia to try to deal with that. But beyond that, I mean, those two are case studies that illustrate the defensive nature of German foreign policy. They're not really gung-ho about going out and really aggressively tackling perceived threats. Partly that's just German mindset. You know, they prefer not to go out into the world, so to speak, and try to tamp down on threats before they become threats. That's kind of the U.S. perspective, and that's a mixed bag. You know, you've seen how that can go wrong. So Germany doesn't want to do that, and there's also the historical implications of Germany being forceful in foreign policy. So the political culture in Germany is such that there's a great reluctance to be aggressive, or what's the word I want? Forceful, I guess, because of the historical implications. So the political culture in Germany makes them reluctant to be aggressive, and they also don't really perceive significant threats in the region that require a forceful response. You know, Russia is a problem, Turkey kind of a problem, but those are not considered in Germany to be problems that are so big as to require, say, a significant increase in military spending, which is something that the U.S. really wants. I can maybe do one or two more. My voice is really going. That's a short answer to that question. Do you think Austria has found an answer to the far right? Can the center-right party in Austria be a model for the rest of the world during the rise of populism? I think in general, yes. But I don't think that's something that the center-right in Austria kind of has by itself, monopolizes. There's a general trend of center-right parties in Europe adopting the less egregious aspects of the far-right policies that are making populist policies popular. So basically, they're splitting the populist vote, adopting, basically giving concessions in some areas, but not in others, enough to get some populist voters, not others. And because that splits the vote of the populace, that prevents them from getting a critical mass of voters necessary to get into power. That was pretty much inevitable. You know, I think it wasn't inevitable, but that was kind of the natural, intuitive prediction. You know, if you go back to some of our earlier sessions last year, that was kind of my prediction, that the center of the political establishment in Europe would try to basically buy off populist voters by giving them some of what they wanted, most likely immigration. It's kind of what they've been doing, and then using that to stay in power. You know, they offer concessions on immigration, but not so much on economic policy. And so they preserve the status quo while giving ground on immigration, thereby preventing a populist takeover, but also giving some concessions politically to those voters. But in so much as that's a part of that trend, then yeah, that can serve as a kind of model. You know, you can see that happening in Germany to a degree, with the center-right there, kind of appealing to some of the AfD anti-immigration sentiment. Emmanuel Macron kind of does that, appealing to a mix of social and economic issues. That's kind of a different thing, though, because his thing is more based on his own personality and joie de vivre of liberalism in France, basically. Kind of trying to leverage that liberal tradition into
joie de
political
vivre.
capital. There you go, thank you. And Italy is a mess. Establishment political parties are definitely on the run there. If they want to get back into power, if that's even possible in Italy, that's probably what they would have to do. I imagine that in other countries you'll start to see that, though. In Scandinavia, I think that's what happened in Sweden. Sweden is a good example. In their recent election, everybody was kind of concerned that a far-right party would pick up significant representation, but instead, the center-right in Sweden shifted to the right, embraced some anti-immigration policies, and that kind of did the trick. Far-right party did not do nearly as well as they'd been hoping.
I think
the next one is about, yeah.
We're at a good spot.
The next one is on Article 11, so that's going to take some time. I don't think I can do it.
Yeah,
quickly.
Well, in addition to that, viewers, these are all on YouTube as well. So if we have, say, a surplus of questions one Sunday, we can save those and then tackle them the next time. If you want to see it as soon as it's over, or say you missed the beginning of this discussion and you want to watch that now, you can go to my Twitch page and click videos and then watch this current broadcast from the point where we begin this. So that's another option here. But yeah, we got a whole host of questions this time. It's really cool seeing the interest. I know a lot of new viewers haven't seen this segment before, but we do this every Sunday pretty much, unless something weird happens, which is fairly common.
Well, there are contingencies in life. Can't be helped.
Yep. Yeah, but we appreciate the interest in this kind of stuff. He'll be working on his podcast, and then that X topic in 10 minutes or less, I feel like that's the golden goose that's going to make you a rich man.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. That's the objective. Well, producing good content is the objective. Hopefully getting rich follows on after. Also, Twitter, for those interested, I'd post articles about current events and economics and what have you. So if you're interested in this kind of content, you might find some of that interesting.
And thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for managing the questions today.
Yep, thank you very much, Fuzzy Cord. Much appreciated.
Cool, so I think this was episode 37 of Agent Smith time. You just got a $5 from Starion. Thanks, Agent Smith.
Oh, thank you very much, Staria.
I love those people who are like, who is this guy? How does he know so much? What are his credentials?
Mixed bag.
He read a book and watched a documentary and he's ready to go. I'll talk about anything, just give me a topic. But yeah, good stuff. Huh?
Just as a parting closing thing, and I know we wanted to do more of this at the beginning, but if you're from Spain and listening, because I noticed we've got a couple of you, how's the new government doing? I wanted to ask. I would love to hear your perspective on that. Just how's the new government doing since Rojas left? Because I haven't really heard much about them. The Catalan thing has been in the news mostly, but not so much the new guy that replaced him. So just kind of curious about some perspective on that. Don't have to answer immediately or right away, but if anybody wants to pop in here before we switch over, feel free.
Well, sweet. Well, I like this time slot. I don't know how this is for you, like an afternoon-ish.
Yeah, it's totally
session.
fun.
Cool, because
I have lots of free time.
that's good. You should treasure that.
Oh, I do. I've been in grad school. It didn't go great, but yeah, I worked hard. I definitely know what it's like. So yeah, I definitely appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, the stream's been growing a whole bunch, and the this time slot, I think, is a really good one. It's kind of balancing the global viewership that is available to watch streams, and then also the competition between other streamers who create content similar to my own, who, if they're online, then the viewership is divided between us, kind of a thing. So this has been a really fantastic segment. Both of the European populations and a lot of the Americas are awake during this full broadcast. If we do it in the later segment, a lot of the Europeans are asleep, so this has been a pretty good one. But yeah, thanks for being on. Episode 37 of World Discussion with Agent Smith, and we'll see you for the next one.
Yep. See you next time. Thanks again.
Nice.